Hello everyone, welcome back to another stream. Hope you're doing well as always. So already we've got Joji Poji, Ascetics, Abyss, Dave, and Queen Lover in the stream. How's it going? So on last night's stream, we watched... How many did we watch? A couple, didn't we? Yeah. So we watched Godwin's New Lore is Weirder Than You Think by Zafe the Scholar. And then we transitioned into Lore of the Gates of Divinity with Eric. And then finished off with The Giants of Dark Souls Explained by Honored Madman. So for tonight's stream, I have Elden Ring Lore, The Curseblades, Failed Ascetics of the Hornsent by the Lore Hunter first. And second, I have The Hornsent and the Crucible by Smotown. And depending on how much time we have left after these two videos, maybe we'll get to Shadow of the Erdtree, Names Explained by Eric, since he'd mentioned the etymology in his previous video. I was interested in that one. So I'm a little skeptical that we'll get to this one tonight, but if we do, great. Okay. So I don't know too much about this video. I know that I got mentioned in it from the Lore Hunter, so I'm curious to see what it has to say. And the Realist and Pyrus, welcome into the stream. Okay. So let's go ahead and dive on. Hold on. Hey. Get out of that. Come on. Oh. Here. I was getting invaded by the dog. Okay. So, let's go ahead and dive on into the Lore Hunters. Curseblades, Failed Ascetics of the Hornsent.
Why, hello there. When we first stepped into the lands between, we were bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, ready to go on a grand adventure with lofty dreams of becoming Elden Lord. So FromSoft placed this to bring us back down to Earth. And they repeat this trick in Shadow of the Erdtree. As the Shadow Tree serves as a twisted shadow of the Erdtree, this bastard is a dark reflection of the Tree Sentinel as a welcome party of pain to bring us back down to Earth as we embark on a new adventure. This guy is a Curseblade, and their similarities to the Tree Sentinel aren't just mechanical. If you've ever wondered what the deal is with these dramatically dancing demons, this is the video for you. Over the next...
It's kind of funny to compare this dude to the Tree Sentinel, because I think I missed him for a while. I don't even know if I saw him when I went to this village, because I was coming from the other direction, because I went off to the south and the east to begin with.
Next few minutes we'll discuss who the Curseblades are, their goals, and how Messmer's crusade changed everything. Let's get into it.
The Tower Ascetics. Iron Lung got vibe checked by him.
Before they were known as Curseblades, they were the Tower Ascetics of the Hornsent. An ascetic... Oh hey, sorry to interrupt myself and pause the video for a moment here, but I just wanted to quickly say that despite my very conversational tone, I'm actually just talking into the void that is my computer when I'm making these videos, and it's only through subscribing to the channel, liking my videos, and leaving thoughtful comments do I know that other people want to hear me geek out about games. So I'd really sincerely appreciate your support through subscribing to the channel if you want to hear more, liking the video if you enjoyed it, and leaving a comment to share your thoughts and truly make this a conversation. Anyways, pardon the interruption, I'll back it up here for you and we can get on with the show. Before they were known as Curseblades, they were the Tower Ascetics of the Hornsent. An ascetic is someone who practices self-denial and forgoes worldly comforts to heighten spirituality. Their humble garb illustrates this, being simple in design and offering...
I'm not gonna lie, I was extremely confused by this depiction of the Curseblades. I was like, what the hell is this? It took me a second to realize it was the tarnished character. And holy crap, does this thing look even more JoJo than I could have possibly imagined with this getup on. Anyway, our Crusader and Iron Lung, welcome back to the stream.
A little in the way of protection from the elements. The most ornate element of their dress is the mask, featuring a crown of horns to invoke divinity, as horns are considered by the Hornsent to be a sacred gift of the Crucible, and tangled horns a symbol of spirituality. They also carry circular blades known as the Curseblade Cirque, which were once used by the ascetics during ritualistic dances to self-flagellate. which, even though that sounds like a lot of fun, was actually another form of self-denial in their ascetic practices. But why are these tower ascetics trying so hard to max out their spirituality through an austere lifestyle decked out in horns and dancing with barbed wire hula hoops? They did all this in pursuit of their goal to become a tutelary deity. A tutelary deity is a deity who is the guardian or protector of something specific, like a particular location, culture, occupation, etc. I spoke with fellow creator and lore nerd Loki DS about the tutelary deities in the Japanese text of the game. Big thanks to Loki for the additional insight, and you can find links to Loki's work in the description below. Loki explained in the Japanese text that they're referred to as land gods, with land meaning a particular village or area, and not referring to the entire land of the tower.
No, Land of the Tower is the homeland of the Hornsent that would later be referred to as the Land of Shadow. I'm wondering where this is coming from, whether this is like the lore hunter or like Loki's interpretation of things here. Because I don't think I've seen anything that specific, but I mean, it's pretty easy to kind of miss some things. All right, what else is it gonna say? Oh yeah, the tutelary deity thing. That's true that like they are considered kind of guardian deities of local areas, and it's like a borrowed term from like super ancient Chinese and whatnot. So, all right. And then, yeah. Elmo, nice to see you again.
We see ascetics who achieve this goal to become a tutelary deity around the Land of Shadow as these large, withered corpses holding revered spirit ash. Loki again offered some additional insight with the Japanese text translating the Japanese ascetic attire description as apparel of the tower ascetic who strictly regulate themselves and pile on austerities. They boost their spirituality via asceticism in order to one day become an actualized land god. Loki explains that the word actualized is more literally becoming Buddha in the Japanese, referring to monks who practice austerity to the point of dying and mummifying themselves. We've seen FromSoft feature a twisted version of this self-mummification process with the Senpo monks in Sekiro, and this additional insight from the Japanese translation fits with the visual representation of the tutelary deities as large, mummified corpses. Bringing it all together, the tower ascetics practice severe asceticism in hopes of ultimately achieving self-mummification to become a local guardian deity to one of the many villages and regions around the land of the tower. So now that we better understand the tower ascetics, we can explore how they went from spiritual ascetics seeking transcendence through self-mummification to becoming the scourge known as the Curseblades.
And I don't really know how relevant this is. Let me double check what Loki was just saying, because I might not need to touch on it after all. Peril of the tower ascetic who strictly regulate themselves and pile on austerities. They boost their spirituality via asceticism in order to one day become an actualized land god. Yeah, so this stuff is still pretty straightforward to get in English, but I've wondered if there's something a little bit more going on. Hey, come on. With the whole aspect of spirituality, the way that it's referred to in Japanese, like reisei, which is like spirit essence, although calling it spirit might not be the best translation, but it's ties back into that thing where I was talking about the other night with like Bleach and the difference between like the soul and the spirit. But anyway, the spirituality ties back into things like the not Hornsent, but the Rauh ruins, like spirit calculus, and how horned beings become more spiritual in nature. Sorry, the little puppy is definitely still feisty tonight. Okay, so yeah, I didn't really have too much to touch on that after all. Okay, and True Connoisseur, nice to see you again. So let's go back into it.
And speaking of deities and cursed swordsmen, I recently read a book called The First Scars by Ivor K. Hill. Mr. Hill reached out to me about doing a promotion for his book, and before agreeing to it, I wanted to do due diligence and check it out. Well, checking it out quickly became me staying up late and reading it cover to cover, As Mr. Hill's dark fantasy world quickly pulled me in, it kept me thoroughly engaged. One reviewer described the book as the mysterious world building of Dark Souls and Elden Ring with the epic scope and character-driven detail of Brandon Sanderson. The book focuses on the branded warriors marked by the church to repel a druidic curse that has claimed one of the fatherland's greatest cities. With this mark, the branded are able to resurrect after being killed. Sound familiar? The first scars wear its inspirations on its sleeve, but it's not defined by them. It explores similar themes and concepts that I love as a Souls fan, but uses the medium of writing to more personally and fully explore the nature of being an undead warrior. I enjoyed following the characters and the twists and turns of their narratives, but I must admit that, like Dark Souls and Elden Ring, it was the bleak atmosphere and expert world building that most engaged me. The mythology and cosmos.
So he did say that it lasted him a night to read cover to cover. I'm curious how long the book is or how quickly the lore hunter reads, because that could be a pretty big deal for something like that.
Cosmology of the world is well considered and expertly sprinkled throughout the novel, and there are plenty of loose ends and mysteries that I can't wait to learn more about in the next 2 books of the Soulbrand trilogy that the first Scars is the opening for. You may have noticed that there was no paid promotion notice at the start, and that's because I turned down Mr. Hill's generous offer of sponsoring a video for 2 reasons. The first is simply that I'm a fan of the book, and it is, surprisingly, Hill's debut novel, and it's important to me to lift up other small-time folks trying to get their stuff out into the world, whose work I earnestly enjoy. The other reason is that it's free to read on Kindle Unlimited, how I read it, and a very affordable book to pick up otherwise. And I am buying a copy for my shelf because I like physical media, and I also want to throw my support behind the Soulsbrand trilogy because I need to.
Alright, so that looks not too bad, maybe between 400 and 600 pages. It's a little hard to tell because of the scale, but yeah, I could see. Anyway, I don't know how I feel about this advertisement. It's one thing to me if somebody's getting paid to do it, because I think I need to do my due diligence as a content creator and share what they're being sponsored by. But in some ways, this doesn't entirely feel relevant to the video, and it's a little bit disappointing and makes me less willing to tolerate it, even though I might be interested in the novel at some point in the future. I almost feel like its own standalone recommendation video might have been a good choice, because this doesn't feel entirely pertinent to the topic at hand. So, how do you guys feel about that? Just curious.
To know what's going on behind the fog in Book 2. So if any of that sounds compelling to you, I highly recommend checking out The First Scars by Ivor K. Hill. Now, let's get back to discussing the Curseblades.
Shunned and imprisoned.
Although the Tower Ascetics strove to become tutelary deities, not all of them succeeded. Those who failed to become tutelary deities were shunned and imprisoned. Curseblade Labyrinth and Curseblade Mira are 2 such examples. The Tarnished fights Labyrinth in the depths of the Bonnie jail, and upon defeating her receives Mira's ashes. From these ashes we learn that Labyrinth and Mira met while imprisoned within the Bonnie jail. They became close with one another, as evidenced by the devastating darkness that Labyrinth is described as to falling into upon Mira's death. It's a brutal fate to commit to severe ascetic practices in order to become a tutelary deity, and then to be shunned and imprisoned for failing to do so. However, I think there's a logic, albeit a cruel logic, as to why the Hornsent did this. The condemned of these jails were sliced up and harvested to fill the great jars, in the hopes of the innards being reborn into sainthood. My speculation is that the failed ascetics, with their intense spirituality, would make for desirable material for the great jars in the eyes of the Hornsent. If they could not achieve their primary goal of becoming a tutelary deity, their severe asceticism made their flesh ideal as innards for great jars as a secondary purpose. And it crossed my mind that these failed ascetics, with their intense spirituality and goals of transcendence, may have seen being harvested for the great jars as noble. However, in considering it further, I now believe the opposite is true, that being harvested is a particularly cruel fate for failed ascetics. Their ultimate goal was to become a tutelary deity through severe asceticism, culminating in self-mummification. Having their bodies sliced up and used for jar innards would annihilate any hopes they may have retained of achieving that goal. This is reinforced by the fact that not only are they imprisoned, but they're also shunned, rejected.
Don't mean to pause, but I just wanted to point out my appreciation for another AMOG enjoyer.
By the Hornsent. Being sent to the jails to be harvested is a cruel fate for anyone, including the Ascetics. Labyrinth's devastating darkness that befell her upon Mira's death was due not only to her losing someone who was close to her, but also because the manner of Mira's death was so thoroughly counter to their shared dream of becoming tutelary deities. And I think that it was also this devastating darkness that kept Labyrinth down in the Bonnie jail, even after the failed Ascetics were given a new purpose as Curseblades.
And I kind of need to revisit Labyrinth and Mira's story because I don't remember if we're given a cause and effect, but I've wondered whether or not part of his darkness was a result of Mira's death, or if they were already cursed beforehand, and how that may play into things. Well, maybe part of their curse could have been because they fell in love, and that could have gotten in the way of them becoming tutelary deities. And that might sound like it's coming a bit out of left field, I realize, but even though I don't like to rely on the previous games more than I have to, at the very least in Dark Souls, like they said, like love was the curse and whatnot, and there is some potential parallels, I guess, between like the King of Alkin and the Queen of Ven, if I'm remembering the kingdoms correctly, but anyway. The Rise of the Curseblades.
When Messmer's crusade invaded the land of the Hornsent, the failed ascetics once imprisoned were now given a new purpose: to repel invaders. And this is when I think they were given the Curseblade title, and in Curseblade Mira's item description are described as a scourge for those who attempted to invade the Hornsent homeland. In researching this video, I debated whether Curseblade was a name given to them by the Hornsent or by Messmer's forces. Ultimately, I think there are arguments for both. They could be seen as a curse put upon Messmer's forces, considering they were seen as a scourge for invaders. However, this title of Curseblade coming from the Hornsent also has some interesting connotations that may help further flesh out why they may have been unable to become tutelary deities.
To further flesh out, huh? So the way that I look at the Curseblades is that they were given that title by the Hornsent before the Crusades, and they were stored away before the Crusade happened, and then they kind of broke the emergency glass to unleash these cursed monsters to fight the monsters who were invading them. So ultimately they were not successful, but it is kind of curious just how many Curseblades are lingering about, and how Messmer's forces have just kind of left Bellyrots and Anirim alone after everything. And then Corvanus and Phantom Leaves, nice to see you guys again. Realist's interpretation was something like Mira embracing darkness after her friend died. The boss in that jail is summoned from darkness. I thought it was the other way around, that it's the spouse who's still there. Because I actually don't remember who you fight and which... You get Labyrinth Spirit Ashes, right? So Labyrinth is the dead one. So we fight Mira. Maybe. And Corn said, you agree? You feel like it's strongly in play they were thought of as cursed by the regular Hornsent. Yeah, that's how I've always read it. Abyss, I'm not understanding what you're asking exactly. Onus? I'm not sure.
Let me explain. As we previously discussed, they were shunned Hornsent who were formerly imprisoned for failing to become tutelary deities and could be seen as cursed by the Hornsent for that reason alone. However, in this video by last Protagonist about the Hornsent, he discusses the Hornsent and additional meaning found in the Japanese text. I highly recommend checking it out for more details about what I discuss here, and you can find it linked below.
You know, I'm pretty crap at making thumbnails, but I do think that one turned out pretty well.
His video Last Protagonist discusses a couple topics that I'd like to bring together. The first is about the divine invocation practiced by the Hornsent. Hornsent warriors and ascetics are described as practicing divine invocation, which Last Protagonist explains is implied to involve letting spirits, kami in the Japanese, into oneself. The second topic from LP's video that I'm going to bring into this discussion is that of the Hornsent having a cursed blood, and how that ties into Kegare, a Shinto term for uncleanliness and defilement.
Every time I see this now, it's just kind of like, yeah, it's spreading. Or also, that's kind of a terrible thing if Kegare is literally spreading. But anyway, it is kind of nice having the community come to a broader understanding of these kind of like more specific cultural context things. A lot of people seem to call Ornstein by a different name. Oh, are you talking about the what's his face in Dark Souls 2? I can't remember what the fake Ornstein is called. If that's the thing you're talking about. This is like when Tarantino has a cameo in his own movies. Well, the biggest difference between me and Tarantino is there's no foot cameo for me to star in, despite it even being a Miyazaki title. So what kind of knockoff Tarantino am I? Old Dragon Slayer, yes. So yeah, they do call Ornstein the Old Dragon Slayer because that's kind of his appellation as to what his like job title was back in the day. They're cursed with infinite poise when you fight them. They're not cursed with infinite poise. If you're using a colossal, you can kind of stagger them a bit more than you might expect, but I think they do have a bit of super armor on some of their moves, though. Alright, let's go back into the Kagari.
Blood, and how that ties into Kegare, a Shinto term for uncleanliness and defilement. As part of this discussion, Last Protagonist mentioned how kami in Japanese mythology hate Kegare. Again, I highly recommend watching LP's video for more detail about these topics. Taking these two ideas together, it made me wonder if part of the reason that these ascetics were shunned was that their ascetic practices failed to purify them enough to adequately invoke spirits. Divine invocation is used by the Hornsent warriors to channel divine beasts, but the tutelary deities are described as having revered spirit ashes slowly accumulate in their hands, evidence of them evoking spirits. My speculation is that the severe ascetic practices were...
The way that I looked at the tutelary deities would be that they let go of their identities and their attachments to the world, and because they let go of their ego, that identity death made it so that way there's nothing of themselves left in their own spirit ash. So they kind of transcended the cycle, similarly to the way that the giants of Dark Souls 2 would go on to become like the tree people in Dark Souls 3 that we see. I guess we also do see some tree giants in Dark Souls 2, but they hadn't fully let go of their grudges yet.
To purify their bodies of Kegare to invoke spirits, and being unable to purify themselves ultimately resulted in them being unable to transcend into tutelary deities through self-mummification. Bringing this all the way around, these failed ascetics could be called Curseblades by the Hornsent specifically because they failed to purify their curse.
He said Hornsent. I don't mean to like laugh cruelly or anything like that, but I just could commiserate from stumbling over my words in the recording process myself. It's kind of surprisingly difficult to say Hornsent ad nauseum and not screw it up. All right, I'm going to back up a little bit though.
Mummification. Bringing this all the way around, these failed ascetics could be called Curseblades by the Hornsent specifically because they failed to purify their cursed blood and achieve divine invocation, and were therefore shunned and repurposed as defenders of their homeland from Messmer's crusade. And I think that is not a bad deal for the Curseblades.
So the way that I look at it would not be that they needed to be purified to invoke divine invocation as much as it was that they needed to be purified because they had performed divine invocation, and that kind of sullied them because they're taking in spirits into their bodies that were not of their own. And this ties into the kind of simultaneous holy yet profane nature of spirits and spirituality in the FromSoft games that I've been talking about for a very long time. And hopefully that makes sense. My dog is still feisty this entire time. All right. And Almo said, do I think the Nameless Mausoleum Warriors experienced something similar in pursuit or self-ideals? Could you elaborate? I'm not sure I understand what you mean by that. Captini's been dehydrating so long that you might be self-mummified soon. You wish you had a water next to bed. Do I need to make my Nightbot hydrate reminders more frequent? I tuned them back because everybody was complaining about how they were insulted by Nightbot pointing out that they were banana-shaped punks, but... Alright, let's go back into the video.
Not only does it sound way better than being harvested for a great jar, but if their life's goal is to become a tutelary deity, a local guardian of the land of the tower, then finding new purpose as a protector of their homeland feels like it has some resonance to their original goal. Their Curseblades, once used on themselves in a ritualistic, ascetic practice of spirituality, are now turned into spilling the blood of invaders in a ritualistic dance of war. Going back to the beginning of the video, their role as defenders of the land is the similarity the Curseblades have with the Tree Sentinels. In both the Lands Between and the Land of Shadow, the first pain in the ass the players are likely to encounter is someone defending their land from an invading force, which honestly sounds fair. It doesn't make getting murked by them sting any less, but at least their aggression is pretty well justified.
Final thoughts.
And there you have it, the story behind the Curseblade Ascetics. Tower ascetics who failed to become tutelary deities and instead became defenders of the land of the Hornsent. Let me know in the comments your thoughts about these guys, as well as any memorable encounters you had with them during your time in the Land of Shadow. I'd like to once again thank Loki DS and Last Protagonist for their insight into nuances provided by the Japanese text of the game, and I highly recommend checking out their work if you haven't. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and please subscribe to the channel and turn notifications on so you never miss out on new Elden Ring content. If you like game design discussions, please check out my video about the Shadow Realm blessing mechanic from Shadow the Erdtree. And if you like both game design and lore discussion, and the Spanish-inspired action platformer Blasphemous, and like ridiculously long and thorough videos, please check out my 5-hour Blasphemous critique. Both videos can be found at the end of this.
Damn, 5 hours for a critique. That is intense. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and share the video now if you guys want to give the Lore Hunter some love and some support by liking or subscribing if you've not done that already. And yeah, so because this topic was so self-contained, I guess I'm a little bit caught on the other foot because I've been watching so many more videos that have been like tying so many things together. It's a little bit different having one thing just stand on its own, relatively speaking. But yeah, overall, I think it was pretty good. Obviously, we've come to some pretty different conclusions about the Curseblades, but there's nothing entirely wrong with that. And right, that's a lot of Blasphemous. Yeah, I've never played Blasphemous. I've heard good things, but yeah, just haven't gotten around to it. Elmo said, as far as the tutelary deities go, some seem to lose their identities, no names, like Black Jewel Knight, making some vow of solitude, or Red Bear killing a Rune Bear. Oh, so you don't mean the tutelary deities at all. You just actually meant some seem to lose their identities, like the Black Jewel Knight, making some vow of solitude, or the Red Bear killing a Rune Bear. So yeah, that's kind of another decent parallel, I think, in that Red Bear, by trying to commune with nature, he does kind of lose his identity, and he is also kind of communing with his own private god or divinity in his own right. So I don't know exactly what would come at the end of his quest, if he would eventually like lose his humanity and truly transcend into a bear. That'd be really cool, and that might also explain some things like dragon communion, I guess, in a bit of a thematic way, if not literal, but I don't really know about that. But yeah. So Blasphemous has really good lore and symbolism. Interesting. Yeah, so I want to play more Metroidvanias, but I just kind of haven't gotten around to it. There was one that I posted like a month ago on the Discord. Something about like Slay the Dragon. It looked really interesting that I kind of wanted to check out. But yeah, okay. So yeah, that was a good video. Oh yeah, there's a little bit left, so I'll shut up and let him finish.
This video as well is linked in the description below. Thanks for watching.
Right. Yeah, so I am really curious about that 5-hour critique. Maybe not enough to watch 5 hours of it, especially for a game that I haven't played, but that's kind of crazy. I wonder if it was good. Anyway, let's go ahead and transition into the next video of the night by Smotown, The Hornsent and Crucible, Elden Ring lore. Massive spoilers for Shadow
of the Erdtree introduced an entirely new region and history to the lore of Elden.
Uh-oh. We got these Scottish closed captions coming in. I'm still surprised that he doesn't put in like his script or whatnot for the captions to be done automatically. But, you know, you guys might not have heard this, but apparently YouTube is now taking the scripts that people put into their captions and using it to train AI models, which is infuriating. Although maybe it's a little bit of a sensationalist headline, and it could have just been like meaning like training the AI to recognize the words to better improve their closed captioning system. That would make sense, but it seemed to be implied in the more chat GPT kind of way, which is not so cool. It's massive art theft. Okay. So maybe it was the other way around after all. Okay, anyway. Moving on from that point. Shadow of the Erdtree.
Elden Ring, a realm that served as a nexus for death and is overshadowed by the shadow of the Erdtree. However, the cosmic elements of the lands of shadow were anchored by the people who called these lands home, the Hornsent. The Hornsent are a Crucible era culture that would eventually be set aflame by Mesmer's crusade. But this is only the tail end of their story, as the Hornsent culture is a rich one, a people with their own beliefs, religion and practices that developed independent from the Erdtree, and this is something...
So this is one thing that I've been trying to reconcile as well, because I think on a surface level it seems pretty obvious that the Hornsent should be potentially affiliated with the Crucible and whatnot, but I am still considering whether or not the Crucible actually arose after the Hornsent, and the Hornsent looked to the Crucible as a form of evolution because it was bringing them to the next level, which they hadn't attained prior to that. And there are a couple snags along the way, so at this point in time, I am kind of more in favor of the Crucible, like, predating the Erdtree and whatnot, but I'm still going to play around with some things, and I've been starting to work on a little bit of a Miro board timeline type thing to just like have a decent visualization of what happens when you ask certain questions. Now, I say that, but I don't exactly know if I'm going to do anything with the Miro board as much as just like collect my thoughts, and I really don't have a lot, so I'm not trying to get you guys excited about something you may never see here. But anyway.
Really unique in the world of Elden Ring. The Hornsent are a worthy study in of themselves, but they also offer a new avenue to explore the lore of the Crucible and the early history of Queen Marika. Perhaps Most importantly, they reinforce the tragic notion of cycles that exist within Elden Ring's story. Marika's order would replace that of the Hornsent, and whilst we know the Golden Order for its cruelty, perhaps those that came before were no better. So join me this week as we unpack the Hornsent, their rich culture, the challenges they faced, their history, and the cruelty that they inflicted. But before we get started, remember that if you like Elden Ring lore, then consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. But before we uncover the secrets of the Hornsent civilization, it is time for a word from today's sponsor, Factor.
Alright, so before getting into that sponsor, here's a not sponsored plug. Yeah, so the game that I was looking at in July, oh wow, so it really was like almost barely a month ago, or a little bit longer than that. It's called Dragon is Dead. It looked really cool, and maybe if I get some more free time, I will play it. And then Draco, welcome back to the stream. Nice to see you again. And then Captini was asking, were the beasts lifted up before all the Hornsent stuff or after? So this ties back into me saying like it's arguable. I think the easiest conclusion to come to would be that it was the before times. And part of the reason why I'm questioning things is whether or not life was blended after the rise of the Crucible later than some people might think in the timeline. But I think the biggest hurdles getting in the way of that idea would be that we're told that horns and the mother of crucibles grew on giants long ago. But the one thing that really bothers me about that is we don't know which giants it's technically talking about. And if it's just talking about the, what's it called? The giants in the Shadowkeep specimen storeroom? I think that's what it's called. But either way, like those things seem really ancient, and we don't really have any modern gigantic giant horned people or the giant spirit steed type creatures. So it does seem like the Crucible stuff should come beforehand. And that might also tie into the way that the regal ancestral spirits were said to avoid the purview of the Erdtree. And before the DLC had launched, I was like, well, maybe the ancestral spirits really have nothing to do with the Crucible after all, because even though their followers had the budding horns, we're told in those descriptions that they hunted beasts that had the budding horns. But at least with the base game, it sounded like the budding horns shouldn't have been growing on those creatures, which made me think that if they shouldn't have been there, is this a recent development as a byproduct of something else? And if Teen Sith were in the chat, she'd appreciate me like making the essential Elden Ring / Crucible radiation reference, in that the Elden Ring could have just been imbuing things with too much life energy, which caused them to be the way that they are. Core never got any info on what the deal is with all the giant claws draped over the buildings everywhere. You're not sure if those are supposed to be banners cut down during the Crusade. Yeah, I don't know why they're over so many buildings the way that they are. One would imagine they'd get pretty heavy and damp if it rained and then just retain a lot of water. But anyway, some of the design on those banners does kind of remind me of the medallion on Dung Eater's armor. It almost looks like a horned sun or his like a mending rune type shape, but I don't really know. So I've wondered whether or not it's just supposed to represent an I can't think of the word. A disambiguated sun. That's not the word that I was thinking of, but anyway. Pyres wonders if and when the lands between were separated from the Shadowlands, or if it's always been the land of the living, separated from the land of the dead. So Miyazaki said in an interview that they were connected in the past, and we also have the Tower of Suppression, or the Suppression Pillar, whatever it's called, which does say that it was in like the center point of the lands between, which further suggests that the lands were connected at some point. But we don't know when. I think the most likely answer for that would be towards the end of Godfrey's reign / the beginning of Radagon's reign. If for no other reason, then it would help explain all the Carians in the Realm of Shadow. Okay, let's go on.
Factor is a convenient meal service for busy Tarnish that takes the stress out of meal planning by delivering chef-crafted meals straight to your door, with over 35 meals to choose from per week, including keto, calorie smart, and vegetarian options. The range even extends to snack options, breakfast, smoothies, juices, and more to keep you going as you attempt Radahn for the 300th time. As a man living in Scotland, we don't have this, but I believe it might be summer where you are. And so for those who want...
That's funny. We don't have this. That sucks. That's messed up. They should hook them
spend
up.
more time outside, Factor can help you do that by getting chef-prepared meals on the table in just 2 minutes. For me, it gives me more precious time in the lands of Shadow, my true summer happy place. For those interested, Factor are offering Smalltown viewers a great deal. Get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders using my link. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code with your phone. Thanks again to Factor for sponsoring this video, and now back to the lore.
The Crucible.
I think a good starting point when looking at the lore of the Hornsent is to establish their relationship to the Crucible, as it is central to their identity, religions, and culture. Belurat lies in the region that we now know as the Lands of Shadow, and these lands once had a strong relationship with the Crucible. We know this thanks to the description of the aspect of the Crucible bloom.
Although, now that I think about it, if the ancient tower hexing arts are based on the spiral, is it because they're based on the spiral because they wanted to rectify the Crucible currents? So that could be a really strong point in favor of the Crucible being like a prehistoric thing after all.
Which reads the following. Aspect of the Crucible discovered in the ancient ruins. In an age long past before this land was enshrouded in shadow, the vitality of the Crucible flourished. The influence of the Crucible in the lands between is often indicated by the presence of horns, like we see in the case of the Omen or the Misbegotten. Thus it is no surprise that horns are very prevalent in the Land of Shadows. The Beast Horn item description reads the following. The Crucible has a particularly strong influence on the beasts of the Realm of Shadow, causing many to grow horns, despite the characteristics of their species.
The Japanese for that is slightly different, where rather than saying despite the characteristics of their species, it's more like regardless of their species. And so the real difference between the wording there implies that when you say despite, it would mean that these characteristics should not have been on their bodies to begin with, which is tantalizing, versus, well, there's no like kind of judgment to go along with that if it says regardless of the characteristics of their species, if that makes sense.
Indeed, we see this all throughout the DLC. For example, a number of animals have horns, tortoise and the red bears. And of course, there are the humanoid people of these lands who have horns, the Hornsent. There aren't many living Hornsent left, but those we do meet all have horns, like Imperium Grandum, Miklas Hornsent, and the other greater potentates. They all have omen-like horns. Additionally, and this is a great detail, if you look at the ghosts and spirits found in these lands, you will note that they also have horns, leaving us in no doubt that this was a horned race that was affected by the power of the Crucible. Thus, my conclusion is that while the powers of the Crucible may still affect people everywhere, including in the lands between, its power was once centered in the Lands of Shadow. Another piece of evidence that reinforces this is Crucible Knight Devonia's presence here, who is found...
Pigsy says midra don't got no horns. Yeah, so I was just wondering then, if the Crucible was centered here, how come we actually don't have more horned things in the Land of Shadow? Is it because of the Erdtree's influence? Like, revolving them? But not in the sense of revolution? Anyway, re-evolving them might be a better way of saying it. And then Realist was saying you find it easiest to make sense of the lore by having the Crucible predate most things. You're not sure if that's illogical with the knowledge of Japanese translations. So, at least at the base game, it was really complicated because while the English term primordial can imply something that began at the very beginning of time, all instances of that are more along the sense of the original, which doesn't necessarily mean something that existed from prehistory, and they were all like used in reference to the Crucible / Erdtree as the original Erdtree rather than the primordial form. So there is no talk of different forms of the Erdtree exactly. So with the Crucible being tree-shaped according to Siluria's tree spear, it made me consider whether or not the Crucible should actually be understood as the Erdtree itself in its earliest form, i.e. that of Godfrey's time, because we're told that the Erdtree was born during the war against the Giants. But now with more context introduced in the DLC in that I lost my train of thought. Hold on. Wow, this sucks. I feel like I'm having one of those tired brain farts, but I shouldn't be this tired at this point in the night. But to be fair, like the last couple of nights, my dog has been like waking up in the middle of the night and puking. So I've had to wake up and clean it. So I've not gotten as much good sleep as I'm accustomed to. So maybe this is affecting me a little bit. So anyway, let me reread that question. Oh, right. The original Erdtree. Oh, okay. So, yeah, with the new context of the DLC, I have started to consider whether or not the so-called birth of the Erdtree was meant in a metaphorical sense, which was always a possibility, but it's just one that I don't like to entertain without reason to believe that something is meant as a metaphor or a bit of figurative language, because you really put yourself on a slippery slope when you do that in terms of like what else can you then put on or put under the microscope of, is this a metaphor or a symbolism for something else? So sorry I lost my train of thought there. I don't think I fully answered it the way that I originally wanted to, but hopefully that worked well enough. Maybe the Crucible has a stronger effect closer to a near limb? Maybe. It's not your fault about the dog, but thanks for your condolences and whatnot. So, right, the original golden tree. Okay, so part of my reticence, reluctance, whatever you want to call it, in considering the Crucible being prehistoric even now is just the I don't want to say like inconsistency in the imagery used to connect the Crucible ideas together, but maybe discontinuity would be a better word for it, because Crucible stuff is used consistently when it's like pertaining to like the Crucible Knight armor sets and the Crucible Knights themselves, but we don't really get a lot of known Crucible images with the Hornsent civilization, and more specifically things tied to red gold or trees. We do potentially have a spiral tree connection with the Silurian armor set with the spiral roots on the face of its armor set, but beyond that, we really don't have a lot of overt connections, and the Hornsent Divine Invocation stuff doesn't scale with the aspect of the Crucibles. Their Spira incantations are of a like white gold, if they're gold at all, whereas the Crucible stuff is supposed to be red tinted gold. And part of my issue, going back to that topic of the original Erdtree versus like the original the primordial Erdtree versus the original form of the Erdtree is that it was in many ways conflated with primordial gold, which is red tinted in nature, but we don't get that red tinted gold with the Hornsent, as I've been saying. And because these dudes were affiliated with Godfrey, it actually made a lot more sense to me when you viewed the Crucible as more strictly pertaining to his time and them kind of blending all of the people of the lands between into the roots of the Erdtree to produce its blessings. But now I am going to have to go back to what I may have originally thought before I really went onto that Crucible deep dive a couple months after the release of like, yeah, maybe the Crucible is prehistoric after all and truly is primordial, much to my chagrin. But anyway, enough of that tangent.
Found in the ancient ruins of Rauh, and her helmet tells us why she is here. It reads the following: helm worn by Divonia, longest serving of the Crucible Knights. It is said Divonia quested in search of the Crucible's origin, and departed the lands of the Erdtree alone. Divonia has come to these lands specifically to find clues of the Crucible's origins, and when taken in tandem with sources like Bloom and Beast Horn, it leaves us in little doubt that this land was once where the Crucible's power was focused. A couple of things I'd like to touch on here before we move on, in regards to the age of the Crucible itself, something I've touched on in other videos, but I think it's particularly relevant here, so I'd like to discuss it. In older videos, I had believed that the age of the Crucible was simply an immediate precursor to the Erdtree.
Oh, and not to like go too far over Smowtown here, but it is also odd to me that if the Crucible is affiliated with the Rauh ruins, that all of its trees, except for the scarlet rotted ones, are all of a green hue, as opposed to like the red tinted hue that we see in the rest of the Shadowlands. So like, man, this sucks because there's like a lot of flip-flopping I'm doing because, as I was saying last night on stream, it feels like the devs are making certain things obvious, but the more you look at them and pull them apart, they don't seem to fit together as well as they should. Whereas this other stuff about the Crucible and like redness and pertaining to like foliage and whatnot, that stuff is a lot less obvious, and it makes you sound crazy for potentially believing it, and trying to convince others to believe it is just always like a bit of an uphill battle. And at least with the DLC, there is a lot more conflicting information to make things even less clear, whereas in the base game, I was a lot more confident that the Crucible was a Godfrey thing, but here I am like flip-flopping again. And Joji Poji, welcome back into the stream, and thanks for the message earlier. Pixie says the trees in Rauh are new. It is said that the ruins have become overgrown. You don't think it was built as a garden? I don't remember it saying that it was overgrown. If anything, I would disagree with that because it sounded like Salza chose not to raise the ruins. Let me try to look it up. These giant ruins are flooded, overgrown, and split into two by a chasm. To the southwest is the Church of the Bud overlooking the Tower of Shadow. Do we get two maps for the base as well as Rauh? Actually, let me look up what it looks like when we fight, what's her face, Regalia. Arugula. So this stuff is all red, which suggests perhaps more recent. And this is me playing at 25% speed. Yeah, I think there's only one map. Let me go back to the overgrown thing. Because there's certainly... Wait, why is it flooded? Oh. I see. So it is kind of like what's the word? Not trespassed, but um yeah, it's not just overgrown in the English word, it's like water and green specifically in the Japanese. So maybe the green is more recent. And that's very interesting. I would need to consider that more. Because I wondered if they were just untouched by the Shadow Tree and the Erdtree because they were the oldest things. Because, well, no, it'd be the water, wouldn't it? For what it's worth, and I know I'll sound crazy for just saying, oh, it's the water without any context to back it up. For what it's worth, in Liurnia and in the lands between in general, the only time you have big trees that actually have green leaves is when they're in water, essentially. So let me pull up some footage. I don't know if this is right. No, this is not right. I thought I had footage of this, or is it just a screenshot? That's definitely not it. Maybe I didn't label it with Liurnia. And then, Jay Dixon, nice to see you again. Are the flying scorpions only close to the Rauh ruins? I believe... No, we do have some by, Bonnie Jail. Or, is that Bonnie or is it the Lamenter? No, it's... Bonnie Jail. Alright, I might just need to look at my screenshots. But this is so weird because I could have sworn that I had actual footage. Okay. So in Liurnia, we have a bunch of trees, and when they're on the lake, they're actually green. But over here, they're yellow as they're not on the water. And the closer you get to the minor Erdtrees, the more red tinted or orange in hue they become. And okay, that one doesn't have any of the green. I don't know if I actually have a picture of those, so I just might need some generic Liurnian footage. Oh yeah, so when they're in the water, they're green. So I wonder if that's the connection, but I thought it could have also been because of like glintstone and whatnot, but we certainly don't have glintstone in Rauh. A garden can still become overgrown, true. What connection do I think the Bud Ramana worships has with the Crucible? I don't think there's really any direct connection, to be honest. I mean, there might have been one at some point, but if it exists, I have no idea. All right, let's go back into this thing. I'm going to back it up because I, got a little bit lost in the weeds here. Maybe a little bit literally speaking here.
Regards to the age of the Crucible itself, something I've touched on in other videos, but I think it's particularly relevant here, so I'd like to discuss it. In older videos, I had believed that the age of the Crucible was simply an immediate precursor to the Erdtree, the ancient Erdtree era, that overlapped with the Age of Plenty. However, even just prior to the DLC, when I did my story summary video, I was beginning to question this narrative, and in that video, having reassessed the evidence and the language used, I suggested that the Crucible was in fact an ancient force that has existed since the beginning of life. With the arrival of the DLC, I think we can retextualize a lot of evidence found in the base game and paint a more accurate picture of the Crucible's placement in Elden Ring's greater timeline. To start, both the Crucible talismans and the Bloom incantation that we just looked at imply that the Crucible is ancient, primordial even. These are very specific terms, with primordial actually meaning existing from the beginning of time. We also have 3 named Crucible Knights,
And I'm officially triggered, but anyway.
Associated with the Crucible, of course, that are named after a specific period of the Paleozoic era: Devonia, Siluria, and Ordovis. All signs pointing towards the Crucible being the source of primordial life, existing from the beginning of Elden Ring's timeline, and this is why it's often associated with the word ancient. That is
And yeah, I just want to let it slide, even though I've done this 1,000 times on the channel, just in case if there's people new who don't necessarily know why I say this a little bit tongue-in-cheekly. But let's look at the talismans. Okay, so when we look at the Crucible scale talismans, they have the same description for the most part as what's in... Wait, where was it? Is it really just Devonia's hammer? Okay, so yeah, it is just the talismans. For some reason, I thought he was referencing something in the DLC. So, as far as it says, a vestige of the Crucible of primordial life, there's kind of a semantic difference in the Japanese where... Wait, what was he just looking at? What was I just looking at? Hold on, let me double check his video. Make sure I was looking at the right thing.
as to the Crucible, of course, that are named after a specific period of the
down over
Paleozoic.
here. Okay, my fault. Vestige of the Crucible of primordial life. Okay. Right. So I don't know if you could say that it's a crucible of primordial life specifically, because the Crucible said that it was kind of like the source of life, or like the origin of life, which does make it sound like I'm contradicting myself big time here, which is why I thought back before the DLC released that the Crucible blending things together kind of made it like a filter on life, and then after things got put into the Crucible, it was kind of the de facto source of that new form of blended together life, where you get the misbegotten and whatnot. But like I said, I probably do need to reconsider a lot of this stuff within the context of the DLC that we've been getting, because in the other parts of the game, when they talked about the primordial form of the Erdtree, it just talks about the original form, perhaps, and it doesn't necessarily have to mean it as like primordial. And the same thing comes across here. Like, the way that the Japanese is constructed, it doesn't make sense to say that it is the primordial of life because of the way that it is. So it's like the source of life is what the Crucible is. And this is like really splitting hairs. So this doesn't really make that much of a difference, but I still just kind of hate the implication in the English that it has to be from the beginning of time, essentially.
These are very specific terms, with primordial actually meaning existing from the beginning of time. We also have 3 named Crucible Knights, associated with the Crucible, of course, that are named.
Alright, and with the Crucible Knights, we also had a couple of other Epoch of Time names that were attached to other characters, like Devon is for Devonia, Flo is Florician, etc., and those are the Bloodhound Knights, if I remember correctly.
Named after a specific period of the Paleozoic era. Devonia, Siluria, and Ordovis. All signs
All right, Devonia's the new one. Okay.
pointing towards the Crucible being the source of primordial life existing
Oh, and Darrowil is like the Darrowilian epoch.
from the beginning of Elden Ring's timeline, and this is why it's often associated with the word ancient. That is to say that the Crucible has been around for a long time, and it isn't just a precursor stage to the Erdtree, stretching as far back at least to the time of the ancient civilization of Rauh, given this is where Devonia has actually come to search for the origins of the Crucible, and it's where we find the incantation Bloom, which mentions the ancient civilization in its item description. Ultimately, I believe that the arrival of the Elden Ring in the lands between was the instigating event that led to the division of the One Great and the emergence of the Crucible. Additionally, if the Crucible is associated with ancient civilizations, there are a couple of other ancient civilizations that are mentioned in Elden Ring as well. First being the ancient civilization of Ul and Ur palaces, which is referred to as the Ancient Dynasty in the description of Oracle Bubbles. I would therefore suggest that the tree shown on Elden John's tablet is likely a depiction of the Crucible, as the Crucible is often interpreted as a tree, and prior to the Erdtree, it was clearly the source of life and power in the world of Elden Ring, and thus will likely have been the locus of worship in the era before the age of the Erdtree.
Okay, now I finally remember where I had lost my train of thought, and one of the reasons why I've been having conniptions about the lore of the Crucible and whatnot is because we're told that the Erdtree is a golden tree, because that's kind of like its literal Japanese name, the gold tree, and it was born with the war against the giants, which is perfectly fine, but we're also told of a tree that had potentially red-tinted primordial gold, so it's essentially a golden tree, but it's not the golden tree that we know of. So it just kind of sucks that we're told that the Erdtree is born at one point in time, and that the Crucible is related to it, but apparently it's a completely different thing after all. But anyway.
Is another ancient civilization, of course, that of the Ancient Dragons. If we consider the civilization of Farum Azula to be part of this ancient era, then it tracks that the Crucible will have been a factor in this time as well. We know from Placidusax's remembrance that he was Elden Lord in the time before the Erdtree, and indeed I now believe that the Crucible was also the focal point during Placidusax's reign. I have often referred to the depiction of the Elden Ring that is found in Farum Azula, and how it's clearly different from the configuration of the stripped-backed and orderly Elden Ring of the Golden Order. Clearly this is an Elden Ring for a more bestial and primal era, ruled over by the dragons and inhabited by beastmen. However, with everything we have discussed so far, I now believe that the branching pattern shown on this Elden Ring is connected to the Crucible in some way, and it's not a new theory, of course, other people have suggested this, but it's one that is seeming more and more likely to me. As we will discuss shortly, I think it's quite clear that the Crucible is a force generated by the Elden Ring or influenced by the Greater Will. And in past videos I have often argued that the ancient dragons and their civilization are likely the first civilization of this world, following the division of the One Great. Consider the fact that the Greater Will never acts directly, usually acting through an intermediary or a vassal. Examples of this include the Elden Beast, the Two Fingers, and of course Marika herself.
And on that front, we don't even know whether or not they're truly in contact with the Greater Will for sustained periods of time, or if they are pretending to have been in contact with the Greater Will, and that's just kind of always been something that I've been interested in. And to top that off, we also have Ymir's dialogue, which says that the reason why the fingers were screwed up and why Marika and her guidance was misled and sent astray is because their mother was all messed up. So Metter is the problem, and Ymir seemingly wanted to replace her, but I don't know how sane of an idea that is, and I don't know how trustworthy Ymir is, despite him kind of hitting at some pretty topically relevant things with Mikola's attempt to transcend himself into a new form of divinity and whatnot. So in some ways, I kind of think Ymir is analogous to Gideon, and we don't really know if he's telling us the truth or what he believes to be the truth, or if he's just trying to deceive us for his own purposes.
Earthly representative of the greater will and vessel for its Elden Ring.
Oh, but it is worth mentioning that the fingers hate kowtowing, so the fact that they would kowtow to the greater will seems a little bit suspect to me, and that they would also be subservient to Marika also seems suspect, although that may have been a difference between the two fingers and Metter specifically.
To me, it is clear that the Elden Ring is the artifact through which the greater will can remotely impose its will, how it imposes order and structure in the lands between. We know that it was the greater will who was responsible for dividing the One Great, the former form of life, thanks to the dialogue that we receive via Hyeta, when she is under the influence of the Three Fingers. As after we touch her when we become the Lord of Chaos, she receives a vision from them, and she says the following.
All that there is came from the One Great. Then came fractures, and births, and souls. But the greater will made a mistake. Torment, despair, affliction, every sin, every curse, every one born of the mistake.
Now that I look at it, I could see Hayata's medallion being somewhat similar in appearance to Midra's. I almost called him Midir. And hey, Jake Peterson, nice to see you again.
Every curse, every one born of the mistake.
If the One Great was divided by the greater will, then it has to have done it remotely. And the Elden Ring is a powerful artifact which imposes the rules of the universe. It structures things and imposes its order. And to me, this event coincides nicely with the events that are described in Elden Stars, where the Elden Ring is said to have come on a star to the lands between. And to me, upon its arrival, it caused the division of the One Great, and thus brought about diverse life.
So there's a couple points that tie back into this, which are not impossible to reconcile, but worth consideration in that we're told Metter was the first star to arrive in the lands between, and we don't know whether or not that means she was on the same star as the golden meteor bearing the beast and that which would later become the Elden Ring, or if that was a secondary star potentially to do something that Metter herself could not do for the greater will, if it had that kind of a relatively personal connection with it, which is doubtful. But the other thing which will tie back into me complaining about all the Crucible stuff is that this incantation is said to be the most ancient of the Erdtree incantations, and then we also get aspect of the Crucible ones. So depending on how one looked at this, it could be implying that the Erdtree itself should have been older than the Crucible, rather than the aspect of the Crucible incantations being something that would come after this. I did not phrase that well, but anyway. Stella, nice to see you.
Caused the division of the One Great, and thus brought about diverse life. Now, it is my belief that the Crucible came into...
Alright, so yeah, the other thing that I wanted to mention, and sorry for pausing so frequently, is that when we're looking at the Fair Mizulan depiction of the Elden Ring, we can kind of see a spirally type shape, and that shape might also be represented in this. So like the bottom portion of the Elden Ring there looks like it could coincide with this, and this might be like where the sword thing is, but upside down, essentially. The hilt of the sword.
And to me, upon its arrival, it caused the division of the One Great, and thus brought about diverse life. Now, it is my belief that the Crucible came into existence.
Alright, and so to tie that back into the point that I was trying to make originally is that if Metter arrived first then should not life have already been divided, or was it divided further after Meter's arrival, would be the kind of thing we should ask ourselves based off of Smo's line of questioning here.
Brought about diverse life. Now, it is my belief that the Crucible came into existence at this time, and has existed from the very beginning of diverse life. The aspect of the Crucible incantations, the various forms that we get, all read the following. This is a manifestation of the Erdtree's primal vital energies, an aspect of the primordial Crucible where all life was once blended together. It is a primordial source in which all life was blended together. Putting two and two together, I believe that following the One Great, the Crucible was brought into existence by the Elden Ring, and from it, evolution happened. I recently did a podcast with Rauh, who made some really interesting observations regarding the Crucible. To Rauh, the Crucible is an analogy for evolution, and throughout this video we will discuss how accurate that observation really is, from its double helix form to the symbols of evolution found in creatures associated with the Crucible. All signs point to the fact that the Crucible is...
And this, using the Hornsent symbol to symbolize, or the spiral tree symbol to symbolize the Crucible, is not something I'm a fan of. If for no other reason, then I think that this symbol is supposed to separate the Hornsent and their access of the Crucible's power from the Crucible itself. So maybe this isn't entirely unfair to use this to be a bit of a shorthand, but I would say that they are refining the powers of the Crucible, which is still ultimately in favor of Smo's point here, but I'm just being a little bit pedantic here. And then I thought there was something else. I'm going to back it up. Oh, right. The thing about evolution. One of the other parts about the Crucible which has bothered me for a while is the seemingly inconsistent nature in which life was blended amongst the denizens of the lands between and or the land of shadow, i.e., why are only certain things Hornsent and other things are not? And that might tie into that question I had earlier of like, well, maybe after the Golden Order and like the law of regression, there might truly be a regression towards the mean, and the more wild traits are slowly slipping away as civilization took hold, but I don't really know about that. I used to have a head? No, I have no idea what you're talking about. You're frenzied, man.
Creatures associated with the Crucible. All signs point to the fact that the Crucible is the driving force of evolution in this world, and it was only at the time of the Erdtree that evolution stopped and life was more ordered, conformed. But I've touched on that many times in other videos. For now, let's stay focused on the Crucible. And with that said, and my thoughts on the Crucible's place on the timeline now complete, I want to talk about the Hornsent's relationship to the Crucible. We've already discussed the fact that the influence of the Crucible is stronger in these lands, even more so than anywhere else in the age of the Crucible. And to me, it suggests that not every civilization would have been affected by its power nearly as much, and that there would have been humanoids that didn't have horns, i.e. the draconian race of the ancient dragons, or Marika's Shaman people, of which we see no evidence of them having horns. However, the Hornsent are particularly affected by its power, as illustrated by their horns, further proof of their proximity and relationship to its power. Unlike in the time of the Erdtree, the signifiers and elements of the Crucible were once considered divine, and this was something we did learn in the base game via the Crucible Knot, Scale and Feather talismans, and these read the following. A vestige of the Crucible of primordial life. Born partially of devolution, it was considered a signifier of the divine in ancient times, but is now increasingly disdained as an impurity as civilization has advanced. And so, as you would expect of the Hornsent, a civilization based around the veneration of such assets, we have a contrasting set of talismans now found in the DLC, the Tanglehorn talismans. For example, we have the mottled necklace, which reads the following: "Horns are sublime artifacts to the Hornsent, and their presence confirms the belief that they are a chosen people. Only the repeated sprouting of fresh horns can create a tangled horn, which is viewed as an irrefutable symbol of primacy." As we'll discuss throughout this chapter, the Hornsent interpret the Crucible as a divine god from on high, a horn-decked beast, and thus the Hornsent have the horns sent from the divine above.
I don't know if I would agree with that characterization right there, but I also do want to back it up and talk a little bit about the tangled horns.
As we'll discuss throughout.
All right, hold on. So, as far as the repeated sprouting of fresh horns is concerned, I think it is pertinent to tie them back into the budding horns of like the regal ancestors and whatnot, which were said to bud over and over from kind of absorbing like life into them and kind of like from death obtaining more power. And it's kind of interesting that the Hornsent seem to pervert this power to essentially get super steroided versions of their more natural horns. And so I think they're kind of going against the natural cycle of things by trying to take it into their own hands. And it is kind of interesting that we have a different depiction of the horns at the top, like the Curseblades, versus what we get down at the bottom,
which is viewed as an irrefutable symbol of primacy. As we'll discuss throughout this chapter, the Hornsent interpret the Crucible as a divine god from on high, a horn-decked beast, and thus the Hornsent have the horns sent from the divine above, hence their name. To them, having horns on your body isn't a result of having proximity to the Crucible, a scientific thing. In fact, it's a gift from above, a god sharing its elements with its chosen people. To the Hornsent, there is no higher honor than having these horns. And among horns...
And I think I would agree with this a bit more if we saw that the Elden Beast itself had horns. And I don't think the things on its back really qualify the same way that these things do.
Tangle horns are the most honoured. The talisman we just looked at seems to point to an advanced growth of horns, a phenomenon known as the tangle horns, that are the result of repeated sprouting of horns that causes them to overlap and create a sort of layer almost. So valued are horns in this society that more equals better. Just as an aside, we can get further evidence of how valuable horns are to their society by looking at their currency. The horn tender with both gold and silver varieties being made by coating horns in gold or silver respectively. This in turn can tell us something about the social structure of Hornsent society, with those of means being those who are in possession of more horns, whether currency or natural. A really interesting observation was made by fellow content creator Dom's Roundtable, who highlighted the fact that the silver horn tender can be farmed from Hornsent ghosts that are found in Ballarat or in the towns, but cannot be farmed by those found out in the lands, suggesting that those in the
Oh, that's a really good observation.
city are those of means and a higher social standing, given the silver horn tender states they are symbolic of the upper echelons of society. In turn, the gold horn tender is bestowed upon Inquisitors as an honour, thus signifying how important this institution, the Inquisition, is to Ballarat society, but more on them later. But in short, the Hornsent worship a crucible in analogous forms, horned forms, and thus it would be great having elements of your god upon your body. It's a divine thing. Thus it's no surprise that statues would be carved to memorialise special tangle horn births.
And I don't remember if I've said this on stream before, but I think it's kind of funny that in another DLC we get another random group of people that have a bunch of horns growing from their heads, and these Hornsent are kind of like a more germane interpretation of like the bloat heads of Dark Souls 1 in many regards.
As we learn via the horned burned item, which reads the following. Tangled horns are a symbol of spirituality, but most youngborn bearing these oversized horns meet a frightfully early demise. These fetishes are made to memorialize them. Tangle horns are celebrated, even in their deaths, and perhaps this explains the prominence of Empyrean Grandam, the character we meet in Ballarat, as she does seem to bear Tanglehorn upon her brow, and yet she has lived to an old age. All of this to say that the Hornsent view the Crucible as divine, as a god, and the way in which they interpret the divine is extremely interesting, and as I suggested, it explains why they venerate horns so highly. For many players, the first introduction they will get to the Hornsent's belief system is via the divine-based dancing lion, when Empyrean Grandam recites a prayer in order to animate this warrior.
O horn-decked beast from higher sphere delivered, take root inside the tower's sculpted keepers, and perched within, we beg of thee, rise. Dance and kavod, cleanse all and wood, cruelty, woe, and those who plague the tower. Cleanse away the strumpet's vile.
Here we get
The sound effects are really loud on that.
a lot of interesting pieces of lore, but I want to focus on this interpretation of the divine as a horned beast from a higher sphere. This is interesting to me because when you examine the lore surrounding the Hornsent's belief system, you will see that they often associate the divinity with the sky. This includes their interpretation of the Crucible itself, which they see as a spiral. A good place to start when understanding this phenomena is by looking at the item description of the incantation Spira, which reads the following. Superior sorcery of the Tower Priests, wielded as an incantation of the spiral. Wrap one's arms together and hold them up to the heavens to summon a spiral of light. The spiral is a normalized crucible current that one day will form a column that stretches to the gods. So here we can see that the Hornsent were able to manifest the Crucible's power as a spiral shape, and this is why the spiral is so important to the Hornsent people. A nice detail that I enjoy is that if you look at the Hornsent spell sigil, you will see that it depicts a spiral tree that is adorned with some horns wrapping around a pair of arms that reach upwards to the heavens. A nice holistic encapsulation of their beliefs, and further examples of their veneration of the spiral shape can be found elsewhere. The spiral tree seal reads the following. Sacred seal of soiled amber, engraved with a spiral tree design. The majesty of the White Tower, stretching to reach the gods, even inspired a secret faith in the invaders, the people of the Erdtree. Thus the spiral is reflected everywhere. They depict the Crucible as a spiral tree. They have spiral candles, spiral pillars. There are spirals everywhere, in Ballarat and in Elden, if you look.
And as far as like the gods quote goes, it is ambiguous in the Japanese as to whether or not it's gods plural or god singular, and if it's supposed to be a reference to like the god as the vessel of the vision for the Elden Ring, or like the old gods with the Amog arrowhead type thing. Anyway, little church lore, welcome back to the stream.
Look carefully. And as the spiral tree seal itself says, even a near a limb was designed in the shape of a spiral to emulate the Crucible current. And with this new information from the DLC, I see the Crucible as something largely intangible, a current of energy that can be manifested as a spiral. It is something esoteric that is hard for humanity to understand, which is why the Hornsent interpret it as a spiral tree. It's easier to understand that way. Going back to Ratataskor's point about the Crucible being the force of evolution, perhaps it's also relevant that the Crucible takes the form of a spiral helix, much like DNA, and this was something I completely missed in my story summary video, so thank you to everyone in the comments who pointed this out. Credit to you all.
And I think that's probably a bit of an easier conclusion to come to, just because the Crucible is a lot more clearly associated with life in the Japanese. Actually, it might not even be that different in the Japanese. But anyway, there's certainly a ton of life coding relating to the Crucible. And going back to that issue of red gold, that spiral tree seal might also be depicting like a red gold hued amber of a tree that may have come before, but we don't really know.
The spiral power emitted by this incantation is a current drawn from the Crucible itself, and indeed, looking back at some of the evidence in the base game relating to the Crucible, we can see this idea was clearly present even there, it's just that no one really picked up on it. For example, the tabard of the Crucible Knights also depicts a spiral shape, and when I was making this observation in my story summary video, something quite funny actually happened. I showed a Siluria Crucible Knight in a pose so I could highlight this tabard. However, as many viewers pointed out, this Crucible Knight is also using the weapon art for the Siluria Spear, which also manifests as a spiral, something I didn't notice, so again, shout out to everyone who pointed this out to me, as this was an observation I completely missed. But yeah, the point being is that...
And it's... I always forget which Crucible Knight weapon has it a little bit differently. Is it Siluria's Woe? It should also be like Siluria's Vortex, just like the Ordovis's Vortex. One of them is called Woe for some reason that I don't know. But they're... I think they're both Uzumaki, which is like spiral. Anyway. Dylan says the Crucible does spiral in the same direction as DNA. What if you flipped it upside down?
Spira isn't the first incantation where the Crucible manifests as a spiral. The Siluria Spear weapon art also manifests as a spiral. But the fact that the Crucible is likely something intangible and is just a force explains why there are so many different depictions and interpretations of the Crucible.
So the way that I look at the spiral working is that if you didn't have it spiraling to normalize the current of the Crucible, then the Crucible itself might be disordered and might be more chaotic in nature. So if anything, the spiral might be part of a new ordering of life, which, you know, may or may not tie into the Elden Ring, and that also may or may not tie into how the Glowmide Queen's God-slaying sword has a spiral motif as well. You can't flip helixes, only the 2D spirals. Interesting, thank you.
It clearly means different things to different people. For example, both the Hornsent and the Crucible Knights see it as a tree, but completely different trees. To the Hornsent, it's a spiral tree that reaches up to the heavens, and yet this doesn't match up to what we see in Siluria's set. Siluria's helm and spear, according to their item descriptions, also are depicting the Crucible, but this shape of a tree is very different. It is more wild and chaotic. But to me, they're just interpretations of the same power. To the Horn...
And to Smo's credit, and he did talk about the tabard a moment ago, the tabard of Siluria's armor does kind of spiral like this as well. So, while the whole tree may not be spiraling, its roots may, as far as we know. Without Horns asks, there's a bunch of spells that spiral too, right? Yes, so as I pointed out earlier in the stream, the, what's it called? Elden Star's incantation has a spiral in it. Many of the Erdtree incantations have spirals within them. Glintstone Shard is a spiraling shard of Glintstone that was an attempt at making a comet. And Dylan, as far as I remember correctly, has gone frenzied trying to look at all the spiral imagery and a ton of things. So if Dylan has anything to contribute, now is the time. I mean, we'll have more time, don't get me wrong, but you're on the spot.
Hornsent, it's a graceful current that can be traced upwards to the heavens. To the Crucible Knights, it's a source of chaotic power, hence why their tree depictions are very different. The spiral shape, however, is only one part of the Hornsent's understanding of the Crucible's power, as I alluded to before. The other is something that is hinted at in Grandam's speech, that the Hornsent also see the Crucible and its powers as a sort of god, a god that exists in a higher sphere, and this is why the currents of the Crucible are so important to them, because they reach up to the domain of the gods in the sky. Thus, it's not a surprise that a lot of the Hornsent's beliefs are connected to the sky and the heavens. Anir Elim itself is a spiral that reaches far into the sky, and is clearly meant to give the Hornsent access to this higher sphere of existence, to their heaven. And ultimately there is clearly some validity to their beliefs and reading of things, as sitting atop Anir Elim is the Gate of Divinity, a nexus of power that affords beings the ability to ascend to godhood. Both Marika and Mikola are proof of its very real power. My interpretation of this is that the Hornsent are correct in tracing the Crucible currents to the heavens, to the sky, and by building a tower that mimicked and followed this flow upwards, they located a coalescence of Crucible energy in the sky, the location that is now the Gate of Divinity. If this is a node of heavy Crucible energies, a force of transformation that is tied to the Elden Ring, then it should be no surprise that it allows someone to become a god, as stepping into this nexus of Crucible energy would have huge transformative powers.
This kind of makes me wonder how exactly the suppressing pillar was supposed to calm or suppress the spirits within the lands between / realm of shadow, and whether or not the suppressing pillar is older than this Gate of Divinity, and of whether or not the Gravekeepers and like the Tibia Mariners and whatnot are also older, which seems highly likely based on how these guys seemingly worshipped Gravebirds and then Deathbirds by extension, and that might also tie into like the connection to the heavens and whatnot, which is why I thought it'd be a neat idea if the Divine Birds were based off of like Deathbirds, or a type of bird that would be like the Deathbird before it died and became a Deathbird, but you know, that's some really heavy speculation on my part. So anyway, setting all that aside, I think it's really likely that the suppressing pillar, well maybe not the suppressing pillar, but the Tibia Mariners are probably older than the Hornsent if they're the oldest Gravekeepers. And if the suppressing pillar is older, was the Gate of Divinity built, and did it kind of rest away like the latent energies in the heavens that would have been suppressed by that pillar and used it for its own ends? I have no idea. I'm just thinking about this aloud right now. Dylan said, plants also spiral in the same direction as DNA, and you think some spirals might actually be referencing plants and not just DNA? Interesting. True Connoisseur says, the suppressing pillar has some ancient dynasty architectural details, so it seems older than Belurant. And that's like another one of the things that's interesting to consider in relation to like where and when the Hornsent fit into the timeline. That has a lot of really heavy lore implications. So I don't think like the ancient dynasty predating the Hornsent really changes much, but I don't know. So for some reason, I get the vibe that the Hornsent are a more recent phenomenon than we're led to believe. Something about the cell structure of plants makes them spiral in a left-hand direction, which you see with climbing vines, although there are a few plants out there that are an exception, and an injury can knock a plant to spiral the other way. Oh, I think I know why, and this might just be because they need to poke out of the ground, and if they went straight up, they would just kind of like crush themselves and like break under their own, maybe not like pressure, but like force. Whereas if they spiraled, they could literally tunnel out of the ground. That's kind of what makes sense to me with my barely grade school level understanding of botany. Little Torch Laura asks, are there any connections between omens and birds in Elden Ring? Well, you said any connections, so enjoy this one. We've got some really angry crows in the Lake of Blood under the Mogwin Dynasty Mausoleum. But generally speaking, I don't think there's too much of a connection between the birds and the omen. Okay.
Additional.
Oh, so if we're speaking about just spirals in general and the golden ratio, as who just brought it up as well, Phantom Leaves brought up. One of the craziest things that I found out when I was looking into the lore of like the snail ladies of Bloodborne is that the shells that they kind of exist within are modeled off of like a nautilus shell. And why the hell would I want AI? Oh man, can I turn this off? Maybe I'll look at that later. So, do nautilus shells follow the golden ratio? It's the popular iconic image for a logarithmic spiral. It is also frequently cited as an example of a golden ratio logarithmic spiral in nature. Evidently, this is not the case. Contrarian studies have proposed that the nautilus spiral is actually in the 4:3 ratio. So anyway, aside from that and the whole like Fibonacci sequence of like the golden ratio and whatnot, one of the things that I learned about the shells of nautili, if that's how you pluralize them, is that they can sink or float based on like how much water they have like within their chambers, and maybe not air. I don't remember the details off the top of my head, but it's kind of similar to how a submarine can float or sink depending on how much like air or like water pressure is in each chamber, I suppose. So I was just a little bit surprised to learn that it had like a legitimate function, I suppose. So anyway, I don't think we have any true Nautilus type stuff to work in Elden Ring, but it was more of a thing in Bloodborne, and I wish I understood what was going on with the spirit jellyfish a bit more, other than like the name for jellyfish is like Kurage, which kind of is like sea moon, I think. Yeah, sea moon. So maybe there's a connection between like the moon and the sea and spirits, but I don't really know what to make of it beyond that. Little Church Lore said the layout of sunflower seeds are supposed to be a golden ratio too. I did not know that, and that might be interesting to consider in relation to the sunflower boss. The Skidoo boss. Okay.
Additionally, there's the matter of the bodies that are found around the Gate of Divinity. These corpses all merge together. In line with my current theory about the gate, I believe that these bodies have been pulled together by the power of the Crucible. Remember, the Crucible is a force in which life was once all blended together, and thus I see this collection of melded flesh as a consequence of this well of Crucible power which it surrounds. I think one thing that we can be almost certain about is that the Hornsent will have had their own mortal god and order. They owned the Gate of Divinity, and so it follows that they once had someone step through it to claim godhood. A Hornsent god who held the position that Marika now does.
Now, this is going to be a crackpot theory. I don't fully believe in it myself by any means, but I have legitimately started to wonder a bit more seriously whether or not Marika set herself up to be the god of the Hornsent, and not for like any conspiracy Jarcent type theories or anything like that, but partially in relation to the concepts of like the sins and when the so-called first sin may have occurred on the timeline, because it sounds more and more like it may have happened later and potentially on Radagon's ascension to Elden Lord and the between times of the sealing of the Shadowlands and his ascension more specifically. So I thought the first sin most likely would have happened at the very outset of her reign, but I am entertaining more possibilities, I suppose we can say. You don't think that's crackpot? I mean, it just takes a lot of substantiation because of the way that the story trailer depicts things. It definitely gives people an impression that that should be when Marika ascended to power, particularly since Mikola has to come to this spot to ascend to power. So maybe it could be more of a Radagon thing after all, but if that's the case, it really sucks that they show Marika in that trailer rather than Radagon. And some people are like, oh, maybe she's transforming into Radagon as she's doing that thing, but I don't really know. And yeah, there's just so much left ambiguous about that story trailer. Makes the mind spin into a spiral.
And I think in a lot of ways the upper levels of Anir Elim look like a royal court, like the arena where we fight Leda, a large circular chamber with monks sitting around the side. Perhaps this was their king's audience chamber, but either way I think it's...
That's a weird statement, because when you go look at it on the site of Grace map, it says that it's the purification chamber. So I would disagree with the notion that it'd be a king's audience chamber, unfortunately. And I'm a little bit surprised he didn't bring up the potential, like, monumental connection. So, actually, has anybody else brought that up? Maybe I should do, like, a quick video on that or something. Anyway, I've got a lot of really quick videos I should do that I haven't caught up on, huh?
It's pretty safe speculation to assume that the Hornsent once had their own god, and were perhaps the prior custodians of the Elden Ring, like Marika is now. As such, I've always assumed that the scene of Queen Marika that we see in the story trailer for the DLC is her seducing and killing the Hornsent god, and taking their power for herself. Ultimately, the Gate of Divinity is a powerful artifact, and no doubt the Hornsent benefited from its application. No doubt this will have blended with their understanding of divinity, that they had a god from among themselves who was granted this position and power by their god on high, given the Gate of Divinity sits in the heavens. So now we understand why the Hornsent associate divinity with the sky. As such, the predecessors to the Horned Warriors, the Divine Bird Warriors, interpreted God as a bird.
Thinking. So I've thought this idea before, but it seemed a little bit nonsensical, but now I'm reconsidering it in a bit of a different light. And you all can tell me how much you might think this makes sense or how much it might not. What if the Hornsent on that tower were sacrificed, either willingly or unwillingly, it doesn't particularly matter right now, to create those golden threads as a spiral to reach the heavens, and in so doing, they contacted the god, which could be like the greater will, and that could have like sent down the Elden beast on that golden star of like spiral energy. I don't like having to tie it to the star thing, and for what it's worth, like the Elden Star's description is written as hearsay, but I'm willing to entertain that idea. You're having the same theory? Like there's a part of it which is attractive, but I don't know, like a part of it which is also just not attractive, for lack of a better phrase. Sounds good to without horns, since you know little of the DLC. Thanks, buddy. Seal of approval. True Connoisseur says the jar people are chopped up. The gate corpses look different. Oh yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's a different type of practice in general. But it's not entirely dissimilar to the way that like the roots of the Erdtree have like a bunch of bodies integrated into itself, other than the fact that it like lacks sap and whatnot. But okay, let's go back to the video. All right, Ascetics, you have a good night.
We learn of these warriors via the ashes of the divine bird warrior Ornis, which reads the following: Spirit of the divine bird warrior from which the horned warriors claim descent, clad in golden armour and granted wings and feathers by divine invocation. Ornis succeeded in taming the divine bird and made its wings his own. As he soared through the sky, when he finally fell to earth, he lived on as a guardian deity of the temple quarter. The first thing I want to comment on is the fact that these are golden divine bird warriors. Of course, as I've suggested already, the Crucible is clearly, to me anyway, tied to the power of the Elden Ring, and this is why gold is often associated with the Crucible as well, not just the Erdtree. For example, we also see that the Crucible Knights have a red gold armour, and so it's interesting to see that the divine bird warriors also associates the Crucible with gold.
So yeah, I guess that whole idea of her calling down the Elden Beast then might not square super well with the depiction of the Elden Ring in Fair Missoula. But to be fair, we also don't really know Marika's connection to Fair Missoula and how she came into contact with Malekith. I mean, that sounds kind of silly because he's her Empyrean Shadowhound Beast. Or Shadowbound Beast? I don't even remember at this point anymore. But I have openly wondered before in the past whether or not the depiction of the Fair Misulan Elden Ring is meant to have been Godfrey's Elden Ring, like the full version that you would kind of see in the title, except instead of having Radagon's lattice structure behind it, it has more roots for like a budding Erdtree. But I don't really know how I feel about that. And then A-Punched and MK. Nice to see both of you guys again. You doubt the Crucible is tied to the Elden Ring? Only gold makes sense. So tying the Crucible to the golden Elden Ring later does make a lot of sense, because we're told in Protection of the Erdtree that the Elden Ring does not start out as the embodiment of order, which is something that I wanted to mention very early in this video, but kind of like forgot about and didn't get back to. So yeah, that's part of like one of the reasons why I haven't ever been a big fan of the Crucible being the progenitor of life in Elden Ring or in the Lands Between, because if it's truly like the central focus of life, why was it so weak to begin with, and then why did it become strengthened due to war and conquest? I know a lot of people hate the comparison of calling it like a parasite, but I think for all intents and purposes, the metaphor or the simile is apt. And then Liquid Flora, welcome into the name. If I'm still looking for more lore videos and channels to check out, you highly recommend Scum Mage Infa. He's just started a month or two ago. He's got some great theories and connections. Love my work. Thank you. So yeah, if you guys ever have recommendations for specific videos, you're always welcome to comment on each stream directly, like not in the chat, because I will forget it in the course of my live stream and I had the wrong form of chat open. Or you could join the Discord and leave it in the channel idea and feedback section, so that way when I'm done with stream I could just go back and add things from there into the playlist really easily. So yeah, thank you for the recommendation. And somebody else has recommended them, but I don't think I've seen anything on my feed. And when you guys tell me to look things up in chat, I'm like, oh, okay, sounds good. And then once I get done with stream, I like get up, brush my teeth, and then forget about the last 3 or 4 hours that happened. And for what it's worth, I also brushed my teeth before this stream. Anyway. Without Horns loves to depict trees as parasitic going all the way back to Kingsfield 1. You have no doubt that the Erdtree is another example. I see what you mean, but I'm just trying to think how recently that trope has really shown up. Like, I don't think the Bed of Chaos is quite analogous to that idea of being a parasite. Although it certainly does kind of spawn, like, literal bug-looking like parasites. But I just had the mental image of, like, the Erdtree being a much more, what's the word? Not tame. But it's similar to tame. A much more tame, rotted cursewood. But, anyway. The last major showing is probably Demon Souls. If you count the old one as a tree, yeah, I could definitely see that. Which I've definitely wondered whether or not there are supposed to be some more thematic parallels to the Elden Beast and the old one, particularly after having seen the monumental-like folk in that cleansing chamber and around Belurot. Especially because, like, the cleansing chamber itself is kind of reminiscent of the Nexus and its layout. Not fully, mind you, but in general.
I see this divine bird religion as the earliest way in which the Hornsent would view the Crucible, and it's easy to understand why they might interpret it as a divine bird. First of all, as we've discussed...
Oh yeah, and that's like the other thing about the divine bird warriors. The fact that Ornis was the first one, but they have that kind of golden armor on them, makes them seem not as ancient as they should, as like the way that they portray themselves. So it seems to me that the Hornsent only really got the idea of harnessing Crucible energy fairly recently. But for what it's worth, I do think that the way that they harness that energy is different from like the Crucible Knights, who might take that life, the chaotic form of life within themselves, whereas the Hornsent use, like, they harness death and like latent spiritual life to call things back within themselves. So to say this another way, I would say like aspect of the Crucible stuff seems internal life, whereas divine invocation seems external, if that makes sense. You wish we saw a golden bird in the game? Yeah. Well, the owls kind of are a little bit... Well, I guess they're more white than gold. Okay.
Ad nauseum, its power is located within the sky. But more importantly, all warriors associated with the Crucible quite often manifest its power as wings. We see this in the Black Knights, the Crucible Knights, and of course, these divine bird warriors. And thus, if they call upon the Crucible's power, and it manifests in this bird way, they might well see it as a divine bird. And so when Ornis's Ash talks of him taming this divine bird, I take it to mean he mastered the powers of the Crucible, being able to manifest it in the form of wings and feathers. Divine Bird Feathers, an incantation used by these warriors, reads the following: a technique of the Divine Bird Warriors, the very first of all horned warriors, wielded as an incantation. The Divine Bird Warriors, and indeed this technique, are said to bear resemblance to the Golden Crucible, thus reinforcing the fact that this Divine Bird is just another interpretation of the Crucible and its powers.
And as I've been saying throughout the stream, that's kind of something that I am more inclined to disagree with, just because it... Even though, like, that's kind of what I thought when I initially read that description. I was like, oh no, they're Crucible related, I'm boned for my interpretations. As I, like, pulled back and, like, settled down a bit with the lore and re-examined it, I do think it is significant that it says that it resembles the Crucible, because the divine invocations don't use the aspect of the Crucible incantation, or the, they don't scale with the Crucible Knight armor boosting aspect of the Crucible incantations, which might be relevant. And of course, some of you guys might be saying, well, yeah, it's the DLC, you can't really expect everything to mechanically tie in, but for what it's worth, there might be some thematic tie-ins to the way that Alberich is set can boost the thorn type sorcery powers of the golden barbs of the Inquisitors, which is not something I would have expected, but I do think that there are enough thematic parallels that I can potentially see where they were going with that. So anyway, moving on.
Interpretation of their god as a horn-decked beast is clearly a more sophisticated evolution of these rudimentary beliefs. There are a couple of similarities, mainly that this beast, this god, still lives in the heavens, the higher sphere from above, as mentioned by Grandham's speech. But of course, intimately tied to this god is the divine beast Lion Dancer. And the form of these constructions are in general an excellent representation of the Crucible era as a whole. Its lion-esque...
Oh yeah, we were talking about the white birch of the trees earlier, or is that in the Discord? I mean, not like earlier tonight, but last night. It's possible that the white birch could have come from these spirally type trees, if you want to call them that. Maybe I should say gnarled, but there's definitely something going on with them.
An excellent representation of the Crucible era as a whole. Its lion-esque form reminds us of Rauh, who was once the Lord of Beasts in an age prior to the Erdtree, and in general I associate beasts and wild violence with the Crucible. Additionally, it's of course covered in horns that are indicative of the Crucible's presence. The Divine Beast Dancers clearly hold a position of great importance within Hornsent society, as the enraged Divine Beast talisman reads the following. I
also just love the appearance of that talisman. It somehow makes like these Chinese lion dance things look more akin to traditional Japanese oni. So like another Elden Ring tattoo idea would be getting something like that on the body. I probably wouldn't get this on my body. I've got some other ideas for tattoos, but there's not enough of a functional use for a tattoo for me to pretty much ever go through with it. Horns are also thorns if you squint. Got 'em.
Beasts are messengers of the heavens, and their rage mirrors the tumult of the skies, of which storms are the pinnacle. Again, reinforcing the fact that their god is one of the skies and the storms, and it reveals why the divine beast and horned warriors practice storm manipulation incantations. Again, they relate the divine with the sky, and thus these holy warriors wield the power of the storms in the name of their god. We know that the Divine Beast Dancers start their life as horned warriors, who slowly progress towards dancer status as their mastery over storm calling increases.
Now, I need to double check whether or not these things are technically sorceries used as incantations, or if these ones are legitimate incantations themselves. Man, I wish I remember what these are actually called. Nope, that is not it. Okay, so maybe this is technically a sorcery because it's wielded like an incantation. The Divine Beast Tornado. And maybe the same as the feathers. I might need to like look at Fextra or something. Aim punched is Paisan? Okay, cool. I remember. Oh, so you're the... Okay, I see. You cast it with a seal, so it's incantation, right? So technically, I don't remember. Well, I know that we're told that some of the Hornsent incantations are actually sorceries, and those might have been Spira and the other one. But let me... Yeah, I'm just going to extra it. So Spira is superior sorcery of the Tower Priest wielded as an incantation. But then the divine stuff, they don't follow any grouping. Hold on, let me look that up. So anyway, my point is, even though that Spira and the Golden Arcs are listed as incantations, they're technically sorceries. Oh, Watchful Spirit's an incantation? That's interesting. part of the reason why I think that is interesting is because all of the other like hex-like things are all sorceries. But it's not too uncommon for like the DLC in a FromSoft game to have what are they called? Like stat reversing type spells, I guess. Heretical type practiced spells and whatnot. Heretical spells. All right, so Divine Beast, Tornado, and the Feathers. It's hard to say. Spiral Tree Seal versus Golden Arcs is a spiral, and they're boosted by the Spiral Tree Shield Seal too. Oh, wait, no. So Divine Beast Tornado is not boosted by the Spiral Tree Seal, nor are the Divine Bird Feathers. So that is very strange to me, and I forgot about that. Or maybe I didn't, but like I just, didn't have it in mind that even the Spiral Tree stuff doesn't work with the Divine Invocation, which leads me to believe it is like truly running off a different source of power. You can cast both with Betters, you can cast anything with that, provided you have the stats. With that Hornsent, there sure are a lot of faith-based sorceries and a number of int-based incantations even in the base game. Right, but the difference is those ones, as far as I remember, and I might be wrong about this, like the Thortheries, as I call them, the Thorn sorceries, they aren't incantations even though they scale with faith, Like the game doesn't treat them as incantations despite going with faith. And Paisan, I'm not sure what you're asking about the they. Are they boosted by the armor pieces that boost Divine Invocation? The Divine Invocation incantations are boosted by those, but Spira and whatnot are not. So anyway, let's go back into the video.
And this makes them suitable to become messengers in time. The Divine Beast armor set reads the following. Armor of fated horned warriors chosen to become Divine Beast warriors, adorned with a lion's pelt. Among the Divine Beast warriors, only those who truly excel at Divine Invocation become Sculpted Keepers, and are granted the honour of the Lion Dance. Thus...
Oh, why didn't I think of this before? So anyway, as far as the Japanese name for Divine Keeper, for Sculpted Keeper is concerned, I believe it's just Yusha, which is like hero or champion. And then Bernal's champion set says that beasts were attracted to champions. So now I'm wondering if that set is now a kind of a reference to the Divine Invocation in the Hornsent land. But I should double check that to be safe, but I kind of don't feel like it right now. So I'm going to continue the video.
Only the most skilled among the Horned Knights become Divine Beast Warriors, and then the most skilled among the Divine Beast Warriors are allowed to become a Lion Dancer. This makes sense, as the Lion Dancer seems to be made of two individuals, both of which seem to be extremely skilled in all variants of Divine Storm Invocation, Lightning, Storm, and Ice. The Hornsent believe these warriors to be the messengers to the gods, and thus we can only imagine the prominent position that these beings held in their society. Though Grandam's dialogue following us taking on the disguise of a Lion Dancer gives us some hint, as she is absolutely delighted that she's finally meeting a Sculpted Keeper after so long.
Does a Sculpted Keeper stand before me? Oh, as I felt the sacred beast's essence fade, a great anxiety welled up within. Forgive this old woman her foolish fears. 'Tis such relief I cannot express. After an eternity of the mind, Our voices have at last reached the heavens.
The lyre dancers,
Which is really weird when you think about it, because in a way she did succeed. She did call down the lion dancer to fight us specifically. So maybe it's because the Tarnished was there as a champion and he was attracted to that? Or maybe our fake Ania just didn't do a good enough job praying before we arrived to excite that lion. It's kind of weird now that I think about it.
remembrance tells us that while they were eventually used in the war against Mesmer as weapons of war, they were primarily used in ritual. The Horned Warrior's martial prowess was in preparation for communication rather than any military considerations. These combat techniques are a ritual dance, and graduating to the lion dance is the highest honour, as they believe these masters of the dance and invocation are actually messengers to the god. Their aesthetic form is of great importance to the Hornsent, as we do see these lions celebrated in statues and fountains and other decorations around and near a limb. Perhaps the form of the lion dancer is chosen to reflect their god, and they truly believe that the horn-decked beast from the higher sphere, their god, is this sort of horned lion, and thus the horned warriors and divine beast dancers seek to emulate it.
So yeah, I still don't know how well I would agree with the idea that the lions themselves are their gods, or maybe this is Smotown saying like god with more of a little g aspect to it, but I think it tends to overlook the prominence of like the tutelary deities and the way that the Curseblades were imprisoned for failing to become the tutelary deities, and the tutelary deities, as far as we know, don't continue to practice the beast stuff. So were they like sculpted keepers who retired, or what exactly was their story beyond being ascetics and potentially lacerating themselves to get rid of their curses?
And this in turn tells us something about the Horned Warriors. Yes, they were soldiers, but in a lot of ways what they were training to do was less about martial prowess, though that was a nice benefit. It was about communing with their brutal and powerful god. They too had to become wielders of the storm. And so now we have a decent understanding of their belief system. It all stems from the Crucible and how they interpret it and interact with it. To the Hornsent, the Crucible currents being traced to the heavens is proof of a divine being existing on a higher sphere. I think one of the main takeaways from this section should be how important religion is to the Hornsent. It is the centre pillar of their entire society. Their capital, Belorat, is built around their divine tower and near a limb, which reaches up to the heaven. In addition to Belorat, they have the Temple Quarter, another centre of Hornsent religion. Their warrior caste are religious warriors, with their technique, arms and methods being directly inspired by their gods and seen as a method to commune with them, whether it was with the horn-decked beast or the divine bird before it. We also have to consider the prominence of Inquisitors within their society. We will talk about them shortly, but a lot of resources and importance is put into this movement, a movement that is primarily interested in stamping out heterodox religions and upholding the state. With that said, let us now talk about some of the cults and minority beliefs that did exist in Hornsent culture, and how the Hornsent brutally dealt with such cult beliefs. The first sub-belief that I want to look at is the one of the Hornsent Ascetics, aka the Curseblades, and these are the extremely difficult enemies that you are likely to face when you're in Gravesite Plains. We do learn a little bit about these unusual beings via their loincloth, which reads the following. In order to ascend from their mortal flesh into tutelary deities of the land, they heighten their spirituality through severe ascetic training. Additionally, we learn from their masks that this is a crown of tangled horns, meant to invoke divinity.
Right, and so going back to that whole point of heightening their own spirituality through ascetic training, that shows that denial of the self, i.e. asceticism, is one way to increase that spirituality, which ties back into how I think it's a different path than the more Crucible type traits of like coming into contact with the Feral Wild, defeating them, having one's heart sing through battle, and kind of invoking the divine nature of the beast that you just killed and like honored them. In honoring them, like, and their death, and that might be more of like an animistic practice, which is kind of analogous to many more primitive cultures in the history of the world, I suppose. But yeah.
This tells us that these monks still believe in the divinity of Horns, but they aspire to become tutelary deities of these lands in their own right, by following a path of asceticism. For those unaware, asceticism is a particular way of living your life that is often associated with monks. It is a life of self-discipline where you dedicate your entire life to a particular belief system and avoid worldly pleasures and indulgence. Thus, the Curseblades are essentially an order of monks who live their life via extreme tenets in order to become tutelary deities. But what does this mean when they want to become gods? Well, I do not believe they actually want to become proper gods. Rather, I believe they want to become something akin to a Buddha in the real world. If we carry on with the monk analogy, Buddhist monks also follow a life of asceticism, following the original teachings of Buddha, using his life as an instructive manual as to how to live theirs. To Buddhists, following your life in this way is a way in which you can achieve enlightenment. Now, Buddha isn't strictly viewed as a god by most Buddhists, but is instead revered for paving the way, for teaching people how to live their life and how to reach a state of enlightenment. He acts as a guide for all Buddhists, i.e., he is a tutelary figure. This is how I see these Curseblades. They are Hornsent who follow a specific set of strict rules, in order to attain a certain level of perceived enlightenment, so that they too can act as an instruction for others to live their lives. This is also not the only time that we hear the term tutelary deity, as it's actually used in relation to revered Spirit Ash, which reads the following: Spirit Ash of those who came before, infused with potent spirituality, acquired from the corpses of Hornsent and other objects that ritually decorate townships and villages across the realm of shadow. The withered corpse.
And that kind of reminds me, it's a little bit funny that we can pick some of this stuff up off of the spectral steed gigantic creatures in the specimen storeroom.
Were called tutelary deities, and revered Spirit Ash was said to quietly accumulate in the palms of their hands. The withered corpses mentioned here are of course those that we can find throughout the lands of shadow, often holding revered Spirit Ash in their hands. These withered corpses again remind me of Buddhism and the practice of Buddhist mummies. I am hesitant to show any examples of these in the video because of demonetization. However, if you want to Google it, you can see some examples of these. But these are essentially Buddhist monks who die while meditating and are preserved. One being Lang Fodeng, a Thai monk who died while meditating in 1973, and his body is still on display at a temple. And I think that these withered corpses found throughout Hornsent settlements are meant to emulate this. They have their legs crossed as if they too are meditating. So these Curseblades.
Yeah, and as far as like the Japanese is concerned, for some of the asceticism stuff, like we saw in the last video by the Lore Hunter that Loki pointed out that it's like Sokushin, which is like essentially becoming a Buddha, like through this kind of practice of intense meditative study to the point like you die kind of, or it's just like the denial of the body to that point where you like literally leave it one way or another. And the other connection is that the asceticism or ascetic practices are referred to as like shugen, the same kind of shugen that appears in like shugendo, which is in Sekiro. And what's the name of the temple there? Is it Shugendo Temple? Anyway, like Shugendo is essentially the practice of mountain aestheticism and incorporates Buddhism in that. So it's like some culturally charged language, at least as far as the Japanese is concerned. Senpo Temple, thank you, without horns. I didn't think Shugendo was right, but the people of Senpo Temple were Shugenja, or like people who practiced Shugendo. Hermit life indeed. There's one that wore sunglasses to hide the decaying eyes, just a fun fact. Yeah.
Want to become something like this. However, as we will discuss shortly, I do not believe the Curseblades are actually these withered corpses, as these withered corpses seem to be an accepted part of the religion in Hornsent society, while the Curseblades are not. It's just that they emulate the example of these tutelary deities. In a way, this tells us about the Hornsent burial practices and how they honour the dead. Remember, the Hornsent civilization is one that predates the Erdtree, and thus Erdtree burial would not be a thing, and it seems likely that this is how the dead was honoured. And given the talk of ash, i.e. bodies that are burned, I cannot help but think of the death rites of the Deathbirds. Explosive Ghost Flame reads the following: in the time when there was no Erdtree, death was burned in Ghost Flame. Deathbirds were the keepers of that fire. So given that the Deathbirds were the dominant funerary rite prior to the Erdtree, I do think it's quite likely that the Hornsent civilization did indeed use the death rites as part of their funerary practices. In consort with the fact that they honour the ashes of their dead, I think we are able to paint a picture of the funerary rites of the Hornsent.
And I kind of agree with that to an extent, with a couple of caveats, in that we can see people literally right in front of our eyes turn into spirit ashes, so I don't know how well the idea of cremation has to tie into it, with like Latenna becoming spirit ash of her own will, or like killing the perfumer Trisha, and then she becomes spirit ashes, potentially. But anyway, setting that aside, one of the things which is a little bit odd to me about Belirat and Anir Elim is that we do have depictions of actual Hornsent graves. So I wondered if they tried to move on away from that practice of burning their dead in ghost flame.
Their dead would be burned in the flames of the death rites, and then the ash would be given to these tutelary deities, their way of honouring the dead. There are some further contextual hints that...
And I don't think that ash is offered to the tutelary deities, because we're told in their revered spirit ash descriptions that, like, after they passed on, it seemed as though the ashes accumulated of their own, not free will, but you know what I mean.
Could further confirm that the Hornsent's funerary rites did indeed involve the Deathbird death rites. One piece of ornamentation that is found around Anir Elim that caught my eye was this boat, that seems to show the dead being shepherded on a boat. Of course, this makes us think of the coffin barges of Carillion Coast, which have bull heads on their prow, much like the Hornsent depictions have goats. So while it's not an exact match, it is hard to ignore the similarities.
That is wild to me. That's like the Scots, I'm assuming, pronounce Cerulean with a hard K.
If the Hornsent did have their own coffin barges, then it would almost certainly link them to the death rites, as we know the coffin barges found at Carillion Coast held the remains of those burned in ghost flame. We know from the congealed putrescence item description that this is the material that is contained within these coffin barges, and massive putrescence tells us that this liquid is the remains of those who were burned in the ghost flame, as it reads the following: sorcery originating from the putrid liquor of the stone coffins. In an age long past, death was burned by ghost flame. Even the remains of tainted flesh were given equal treatment in death. Of course, we don't know for certain. This is just my interpretation of the contextual evidence, but I do believe that the Hornsent had their own funerary practices that started with the Deathbirds, involved a boat, and ended in the hands of the tutelary deities.
And then MK was thinking that the Hornsent just didn't burn the ones with the horns, which is a pretty good assumption, especially because on the graves of the Hornsent, we see actual like horns on them, where you would typically see like the cross in like Christianity grave markers. But yeah, I digress. Phantom Leaves said, do I think washing up in the land of shadow was by design do I think death washing up in the land of shadow was by design or a side effect? I'm not sure, to be honest. And a lot of my confusion stems from a lack of knowledge of what the Lands Between was like back when the Shadowlands were integrated into it. So, good question.
Now, despite the importance of these tutelary deities, it does seem as though the Curseblades were not universally loved in Hornsent society, suggesting that while they emulate these tutelary deities, the Curseblades have never actually achieved this status, and indeed the Curseblades are actually reviled by greater Hornsent society. We learned something of this via Curseblade Mira's ashes, which read the following. These ascetics who failed to become tutelary deities were a scourge for those who attempted to invade the Hornsent homeland. Long ago, before the land was overshadowed by invasion, this scourge was shunned, and the Curseblades were imprisoned. It was during this confinement that Mira met Libereth, and upon her death, Libereth was plunged into a devastating darkness. So yeah, it seems as though this movement was shunned and actually imprisoned by Hornsent society, given we also find Libereth still within a jar jail. And to reinforce the fact that the tutelary deities that we actually do find in the Lands of Shadow were not part of this movement, one need only look at the Outer God Heirloom Talisman, which confirms that praying to one of these tutelary deities is an act of sanctity. The Curseblades wanted to become these tutelary deities, but they were not. Instead, they were an extreme sect that was seen as a scourge to Hornsent society, imprisoned within their jar jails. However, of course, during...
And then, of course, not to quote Smo right there, the fact that many of the Hornsent seemingly prayed to the tutelary deities might show a conflict of interest in saying that they prayed to the lions as their gods, as much as it seems to be like more of a general animistic type of spiritual practice of a more ancient people, perhaps, but I don't really know. A scourge is the name of a whip used in self-flagellating asceticism? Did not know that.
Mesmer's invasion, this scourge became very useful, because these Curseblades are extremely dangerous in combat, as I'm sure most of you are aware. Now, there are a couple of reasons why they might have been imprisoned by Hornsent society. First of all, ultimately their sect is a failure. They practice these brutal aesthetic ways of living, and yet they have failed to become tutelary deities. Additionally, they are quite extreme in their methods. We do learn a little bit of their darker side via their blades, which read the following. Long ago, this was employed by the ascetics who strove to become tutelary deities as a ritualistic object in their self-flagellating dances. Perhaps the violent nature of this self-flagellation led to these beings becoming reviled, and perhaps the Hornsent society just didn't like a new religious movement that was armed and violent taking place within their lands, and as such they were named a scourge and imprisoned. However, the Curseblades weren't the only sect that were imprisoned in the jar jails. There are also the lamenters, which we find in another jail, and the lamenter's mask reads the following. This transformation tallies with the state of a denizen of paradise, but the people of the tower denied it and hid it from the world. In their foolishness, they viewed true bliss with deep fear. So again, the lamenters seem to be a sub-religion or cult that were imprisoned in the jar jails by the tower. And whilst these are both very extreme cults, and no wonder they were imprisoned, we are starting to see a pattern here of Belurat being quite intolerant of different cults and belief, and that they would quickly imprison these different sects. Hornsent society was a dogmatic one, and therefore it isn't a surprise that Inquisitors play a big role in their society.
And I wonder if part of the reason they were so anti-lamenter is because the lamenters were kind of literally cursing people with their lamentations and causing them to suffer, which would go on to propagate even more curses. But of course, that's just speculation on my part.
We can assume that the Inquisitors occupied a position of...
And then MK thought the lamenter was an occurrence, not a cult. Yeah, I don't know if we've had multiple lamenters since we've only seen the one, but maybe?
a big role in their society. We can assume that the Inquisitors occupied a position of prominence within Hornsent society because of a couple of item descriptions, such as the Inquisitor's ashes, which reads the following. Inquisitions often perplex the minds of the uninitiated, and so seniority was viewed as an asset. Clearly the Inquisitors were viewed as great thinkers, whose investigations and judgments would likely be respected, if not understood. Then we of course have the Goldhorn Tender, which reads the following. Old currency used by Hornsent, made by coating spiral horns with gold, once bestowed upon Inquisitors as an honour. We discussed earlier the importance of horns, and these tenders, and how they signify one's position in society. Thus we can conclude that these Inquisitors were valued greatly in Ballarat, given the silver one is said to be in the possession of the upper classes of Hornsent society, and so if Inquisitors are getting gold ones, they must hold an even higher social status than even the upper classes of Ballarat. And perhaps it's no surprise that Inquisitors hold a high position of respect within Ballarat society, given all that we have discussed already about the importance of their dogma and the imprisonment of other cults. The main real-life example of an Inquisition is of course the Spanish Inquisition, which
Nobody expected that. Alright, so without horns said, and here you thought that the driving one's enemy before them, I'll stop using like the third person. And here I thought that driving your enemy before you and hearing the lamentations of their women was the best thing in life. Well, that is truly why the lamenter discovered bliss, isn't it? And yeah, Phantom Leaves, feel free to bring those questions up in the semantics channel.
Was a religious movement, and likewise I think it is safe to assume that the Hornsent Inquisition is meant to investigate and purge any heresies, like that of the Lamenters and the Curseblades. This in turn tells us how important the state religion was to the Hornsent, and that they would not allow anything that did not fit in with this belief system, or challenged it, and indeed would punish such instances harshly and brutally. Indeed, the weapon art for the Great Sword of Damnation, a warped version of the Inquisitor barb, comments on how like the Golden Order and the Hornsent were in the application of power. Additionally, we can look to the signature weapon of the Inquisitors, the barbed staff spear, as evidence of their brutal judgments, as its description reads the following. Great Staff of Jory, Elder Inquisitor. The tip bristles with golden barbs symbolic of the Inquisition's torture, allowing one to wield the staff as a great spear. The mention of the Great Sword of Damnation and Inquisitor Jory of course brings us to the most significant instance of the Inquisition's work that we can see, the censoring of Midra and his followers, and the cruel treatment they suffered at the hands of the Inquisition. The map for the Abyssal Wood names Midra as a sage. The use of this term sage has interesting connotations, and we see this word used in relation to Sage Gowrie and the Sage set from the base game, the latter of which reads the following. Thick burgundy robe, attire of the wise sages who were deemed heretical. I feel like this definition of a sage can be somewhat applied to Midra as well, in that he is a man of learning and intelligence, but one that was deemed heretical. We can only speculate on what led Midra to the Frenzied Flame, but given the size of his library, I would guess that he was just a man of learning, and in the course of his studies, he would discover the path of the Lord of Chaos. Senior Inquisitor Jory himself serves as the first line of defense against any who would try to enter the frenzy-touched lands of the Abyssal Woods. The Inquisitors still patrol these lands, and they themselves are not immune to the Frenzied Flame, as those we face here are capable of unleashing the Frenzied Flame's power, emphasising that containment really is the only option here. The lands are so saturated by the flame's power that it visibly manifests on every rock and tree. It is of course understandable that the authorities would want to contain this spread. We know from the base game how destructive and apocalyptic the Frenzied Flame can be. However, that still does not quite prepare us for the scene that awaits us at Midra's manse. Out in front of the manse we can see a line of executed bodies, with a piece of gold protruding from their neck, likely signifying the presence of a barbed staff spear within them. Inside, we have the ghosts of those who were...
And I've wondered whether or not the reason they were beheaded this way and have the little Inquisitor weapon hilts sticking out of them could be because when one becomes the Lord of Frenzied Flame, the head disappears. So maybe if they got rid of the head to begin with, they wouldn't have as many fears of running into that Lord of Frenzied Flame. And I don't know how I feel about that, because then they definitely done goofed with leaving Midra and his head intact on his body.
Of a barbed staff spear within them. Inside, we have the ghosts of those who were slaughtered by Inquisitors, still wondering what justified such rough treatment, with the Inquisitors themselves still present here, no doubt a station from which there was no return. Given that they are now likely tainted by the flame, they have to remain here. Of course, at the top of the manse we have Midra himself, with a spear staff still painfully embedded in his body, and yet, unlike his servants, Midra has not been granted the mercy of an execution, and instead has been left to live through this eternal pain. We do have to wonder why this choice was made. Surely it would be safer and more efficient to just kill Midra. After all, Midra is still able to become the Lord of Frenzied Flame.
And for what it's worth, the Inquisitors might have thought that they actually killed him, because I imagine that this isn't too common of an injury that people just walk off in the Lands Between or even the Land of Shadow. Although that's kind of a funny idea. And then Global Sequence, nice to see you again. You're wondering what makes the Frenzied Flame having a head or missing a head? Yeah.
In so a lot of ways, the Inquisition seemingly failed. Perhaps cruelty was more important to the Inquisition, and that making an example of Midra took priority over more efficiently dealing with this. Or perhaps there's more than meets the eye here, and that the Inquisition couldn't kill Midra without unleashing the Frenzied Flame. After all, in the cinematic where Midra becomes the Lord of Frenzied Flame, he drags the barbed staff spear through his body and seemingly decapitates himself in the process. Indeed, Midra's head seems to have once been an item that was cut from the game. So with that,
which would have been cool to see something like that.
That in mind, perhaps the Inquisitors knew that Midra would become the Lord of Frenzied Flame if they executed him like they did his followers, because the flame had taken root too strongly in him at this stage, and as such they just contained Midra and watched over him as he was punished by the staff spear.
And that intro for Midra is so cool. Not what I expected, and I'm a little bit disappointed we didn't have more of an American connection between Midra and the DLC, but nonetheless, this is still super cool. It's just one of those problems where, in many ways, you can't always live up to people's expectations, which is why it's a little bit safer to give them nothing to begin with. Which is what FromSoft does a really good job of, all things considered, up until they're finally ready to announce things. So it's just kind of crazy how little we actually knew about the DLC heading into it up until that final day with that the final launch trailer spoiling almost everything.
I will cover Midra and the Frenzied Flame more in a future video, and as such I will likely leave his story there for now. But the events at Midra's manse are a fascinating insight into how the Hornsent would deal with those who fell afoul of their dogma. Of course, we cannot talk about the brutality of the Hornsent without assessing the Jar jails and their treatment of the Shaman people.
The Jars and Shamans.
Our main source of information on the Jar jails comes from Bonnie Village, where apparently these jars are prepared. The greater potentates still roam this village, and they wield instruments of their trade, the Bonnie Butchering Knives, which read the following: Weapon of the Greater Potentates of Bonnie Village, an outside butcher's cleaver used to dismember human bodies in the making of the great jars stored in the jails. This is a brutal craft, and the caterpillar mask that are worn by the Greater Potentates is the one that is also worn by the Hornsent of Mikla's companions, seemingly indicating that this Revenger was once part of this cruel brotherhood. And so the Potentates of Bonnie Village would butcher those who need to fit inside the jars. However, dismembering bodies is only part of the process, and we learn more at the whipping shed that lies on the outskirts of this village. Here we find the Tooth Whip, which reads the following: Filthy and seething with disease, the teeth are embedded in the whip and dose the victim with deadly poison upon each strike. As the wounds ripen, they grow inflamed and ooze pus. The flesh of the shamans was said to meld harmoniously with others. So there are two parts of the process that is required: dismembering of other victims, but then tenderizing the shamans with the whip, so that their flesh would become the sort of glue that would meld everyone together.
Yeah, and I'm glad he pointed it out that way, because the Japanese is a little bit more clear on that front, that it's only after the flesh of the Miko have become oozing and festering that it melds harmoniously with others, which is even more brutal somehow.
It specifically mentions that shaman are the base material for these jars, that their flesh has special properties that allows them to meld with others when tenderized by the Tooth Whip. The dialogue of the ghost found here at the whipping shed confirms that the shamans were the race who were subjected to this brutal treatment, as he says, "For pity's sake, your place is in the jar. Nigh Saint Toot itself awaits you within. For shamans like you, this is your lot." This dialogue tells us quite a bit. Firstly, it confirms that shamans are the main target of this jar process, or a constituent part at least. And clearly, they were seen as lesser than the Hornsent, with this whipping ghost essentially saying that the treatment they are getting right now is the best that they can hope for, that they are so low that they should be grateful for this treatment. Given all we have discussed, it shouldn't be...
I don't know if that is true, because another way that one could read what's going on with the jarring ghost would be that I'm trying to say it in a way that doesn't sound the exact same way that Smo said it, but still highlights the difference, and I'm struggling. So, I might just need to endure and struggle regardless. As far as that is concerned, the Hornsent may have been able, or they might have wanted to kill the Miko and whatnot beforehand, but they might have found more utility in keeping them alive. And through that kind of lens, the Jargo saying that life were accorded the Miko for becoming jar innards could be meant in a derogatory way rather than a purposeful way, I guess. I don't know. I'm struggling. It's late. I'm tired. And then Elden Enthusiast, nice to see you again. We should have gotten a midra headpiece. And then you asked, why do all impure bodies become putrescence? Because impurity in Kegare is directly related to curses in FromSoft games, and putrescence is extra impure crap, just congealed into this liquor, as they call it, and all of that putrescent stuff seems to have ghost flame associated with it, so it seems very curse laden, I guess. And does that have to do with the suppressing pillar? Maybe, but the suppressing pillar was supposed to calm things. It does kind of suck that it went with suppression as the localization choice. So the suppressing pillar might have been meant to soothe the dead so that they didn't become more like putrescence or curses, I guess. And then Pyrus wonders if there are any Japanese myths about Miko which have parallels to the story of Marika. Well, I guess that depends because, like, as far as Miko are concerned, they're typically like shrine maidens, and they aren't necessarily like the chief administrators of like religious rites. But the term is so old and ancient, it's kind of hard trying to stick to one definition, and I don't know enough about like the history of Miko and like the stories associated with them, especially regionally, to know if there are any Miko that are directly comparable to Marika. But there certainly are stories of like women invoking divinity, because Miko would allow spirits to possess their bodies and whatnot, and come into contact with kami that way. And part of the issue is like the way that kami are presented in Shintoism don't overlap extremely well with the way that kami or a kami is presented in Elden Ring. So, good question though.
Too much of a surprise that the Hornsent treat the shamans this way. They are clearly a different people with different beliefs, and thus are likely to be persecuted by the dogmatic Hornsent. On the forehead of the jars, we can even say they bear some kind of brand, perhaps branding them as a shaman, someone marked for this cruel fate. The shamans themselves are very interesting, and suffice it to say I will be doing a full video on Marika and the shamans. Later on, we find the village of the shamans, bathed in the golden light of the incantation Minor Erdtree, its placement and item description confirming that this is the original home of Queen Marika, and her people are these shamans.
And one of the most interesting parts of this description is that it says it's the kindness of gold without order, which suggests to me that perhaps the first iteration of the Erdtree was without order, and may pertain more specifically to what would go on to become the Golden Order.
No doubt, this is why this place is somewhat protected by the Black Keep now. Its entrance is sealed by a statue of Marika, and it's defended by 2 tree sentinels. The ravages of Mesmer's crusade didn't reach here, and it's likely a holy place to those of the Erdtree. The term shaman usually relates to magic or religion, and given Marika's association with trees, and the fact that the grandmother figure of the village seems to have grown into a tree, we can assume that these are people of naturalistic magic, or belief. Ultimately, all that really matters is that their beliefs will have differed and contravened that of the Hornsent, and as such they will have been a target for persecution and the Inquisition. But what is the point in this jar punishment? Why do they do this? Well, I still maintain the suggestion that I put forward in my story summary video a few weeks ago, that these jars are meant to replicate the Crucible, by blending life together in a fairly gruesome homage. This is why I think it's near sainthood, because they are taking these heretics and reforming them in the image of the Crucible. That's just my take on this punishment. However, it's worth noting that there are other theories that are very interesting and worth exploring. For example, the Centered Tarnished, whose video I will link below, made a really interesting theory. The Centered Tarnished believes that these jars were a genuine attempt at creating a saint or a god, and that by melding all these bodies together, a god or divine being would emerge eventually. Centered Tarnished believes that Marika, as a god, was a success in this regard, a successful jar recipe, if you will, and that the horrific jar innards we face in the jar jails are just failed versions. And whilst I still lean towards the jars just being a punishment rather than a genuine attempt at creating divinity, I do absolutely love this theory, and so I would direct you to the Centered Tarnished original video, which again will be linked below. But now that we've discussed the dogma of the...
And for people wondering on my take about that, I've talked about it a lot, came up on last stream as well. The term used for the saints are essentially just like good people in Japanese, and it doesn't have as strong of a religious connotation as it does in English. And the jarring ghost is just telling the thing that it's supposed to be drawing. It's like, hey, be a good girl, get in the jar. This is what your life is for, essentially. So I don't think they're literally making saints, although maybe there is a kind of a higher form of spirituality to gain through this process. But if that's the case, we don't really get the best indicator of that based on what we see in the jar villages or the jar jails.
Hornsent in quite a lot of detail, as well as the various sub-religions and cults, I want to talk about another facet of their history, and that is their interactions with the outer gods.
Ooh-wee.
We have now seen countless examples of the Hornsent coming down heavy on different cults and beliefs. However, it does seem as though some sub-beliefs were allowed, and in this case I am referring to the Church of the Bud, which we can find at the far end of Rauh. However, I do believe it was likely once attached to the same landmass that Belurat now occupies, as we can see they are extremely close geographically, and I believe that this land was once connected to one another and it made up a part of the greater metropolis of Belurat.
Don't we see this somewhere else as well? Or is it literally just here? I don't remember.
Part of my reason for believing so is that the Church of the Bud is actually of Hornsent construction and not a remnant of the ancient civilization of Rauh. We can tell this because of the pillars in the church that have Bud statues on top of them are the signature spiral columns of the Hornsent that we can find in Belurat itself, leaving us in no doubt that this is a Hornsent building. Understanding that the Church of the Bud is a Hornsent institution allows us to make more sense of what we see in the story trailer. In the moment where we see a figure silhouetted by the flames of Messmer's crusade, cradling a spear. An extremely unique spear that we then see in the hands of one of the game's bosses, Romina. And the description of the pole blade of the Bud reads the following. Weapon of Romina, Saint of the Bud. A scarlet glaive with a dangling bud-like blade. Once in the crumbling, burning church, Romina held the Bud in speechless silence. That Bud would become her blade. The moment being described here is what we witness in the story trailer, Romina cradling the blade as Belurat and the Hornsent civilization is burned around her. And this means that the worship of the Bud was an accepted part of Hornsent society. As for what this religion was, is unclear, aside from the fact it wasn't always connected to the Scarlet Rot like it is now, as the Scarlet Bud item description reads the following. There was a time when these buds were not touched by the Scarlet Rot's blight, when they were the symbol of the small church deep in the ancient ruins of Rauh. So in the time before they were touched by the Scarlet Rot, they were still representative of the buds of the church, and therefore this religion. Indeed, it seems like Romina manifested the Scarlet Rot after Messmer's crusade happened, as her remembrance reads the following. After the church was burned to the ground, Romina discovered a twisted divine element, which she weaved into the baleful Scarlet Rot. Perhaps then, the buds might find somewhere to gain purchase once more within the scorched remains. What is...
And as far as like the Japanese is concerned, it almost sounds backwards from the English, where the English kind of makes it sound as though she's discovering a divinity that's separate from the Scarlet Rot and infusing Scarlet Rot with the divine element of her bud. But it's kind of the opposite case, where she discovered a twisted divinity within Scarlet Rot, which she then weaved into her bud, so that way it could bloom again once more within the scorched remains of the church.
This divine element? Well, I do have a couple of ideas. The first, of course, being that it's simply an element of the outer god of Rot. A similar language is used a couple of times in relation to this particular outer god, like in the hefty pot of Rot and the map of the lake of Rot, which reads the following. It is said the divine essence of an outer god is sealed away in this land. As such, I think that in her despair, she somehow connected with a part of this outer god of Rot, and the Scarlet Rot manifested. As for what the Church of the Bud believed in prior to it becoming associated with the Scarlet Rot, we can but guess. but perhaps they did worship the outer god of rot in the form of a bud. It was their interpretation of this being. This could explain how.
And I also think there's a decent amount of parallels between the way that Ramana discovered that twisted deity within Scarlet Rot and the way that the Blood Fiends discovered a twisted deity in the shadow of their revered tutelary deity's ancestor body. Corpse, whatever you want to call it. And then Elden says that the rot pots say that Scarlet Rot is a divine essence. Yes. Little Church Lore agrees. Cool. MK says maybe Marika discovered two fingers like that. So do you think what do you think she would have discovered it in, if you don't mind me asking?
How Romina was able to manifest the Scarlet Rot. After all, she was in despair in a church that could have been dedicated to this outer god. We know that the Hornsent interpreted the Crucible in their own form, so perhaps they worshipped the outer god of rot in a different form as well. One need only.
And speaking about like the outer god of rot and like worshipping rot, I am really curious how the mushroom folk fit onto the timeline, especially with like them being ancient kings or something like that. I don't quite remember, but maybe they're just all along with the ancient dynasty and we just don't really know. Oh, you think Marika communed with the two fingers out of despair for her people? Maybe. I could see something like that, yeah. And we've also got the Elden John statues in the Lake of Rot. True.
Look at the item icon for the Scarlet Aeonia incantation to see the clear similarities to this and the Bud of the Church. Additionally, Romina's remembrance tells us that the Buds were able to gain purchase once more, as if the Bud religion is based on a memory of the Scarlet Rot from long ago, as if it once held sway in these lands, giving birth to Buds, and thus this religion. I do believe this is likely.
I'm not sure I totally understood Smo right there, but yeah, I would just I think that the religion of the Bud predates. Well, hold on, let me try to like rephrase this. I think the religion of the Bud was originally disconnected from the Scarlet Rot, and the Scarlet Rot is perverting the practice of the Church of the Bud eventually.
As we know that the outer god of rot has had worshippers in the past, as is the case with the Old Lords of Rot, that's described by the Mushroom Crown, which reads the following. Long ago, great lords served the Scarlet Rot. Perhaps such fungal bodies served as their crowns. Ultimately, I believe that the Hornsent worshipped the outer god of rot in the form of a bud, and that when the church was burned down in the Crusade, Romina managed to connect to this being and bring the Scarlet Rot into this realm.
I was going to say, I don't know about that, but I guess we also do have the Hornsent like eating scorpion stew. So it almost seems like they would have been against the rot to begin with, but I guess it really just depends on one's interpretation of stuff like that. I am losing it. Little Church Lore said, Ramana is part centipede, and you wonder if there are any implications or ties to the curse mark. That's an interesting question. I don't know how fair it would be to compare Ramana to the centipede, despite her appearance, because she also has a number of other things going on. She's got like Vespa fly-like wings, or not fly, but bee-like wings, hornet-like wings at times, and she's got like the stinger of a scorpion as well as like the stinger of a bee underneath her when she's like up in the air. She's also got like a bunch of spider-like legs despite being partially centipedal, I guess, if that's even a word. So I think she would pretty much just use anything she could to kick your ass. I don't think that's totally relevant to like the initial curse mark. Although maybe if you want to go like for a more thematic reading, you could say that because the centipede kind of represents death, and scarlet rot, it represents an endless cycle of death and rebirth, or samsara, that it could be incorporated into her that way, and the other forms of life are just like one of the counterparts to death, I suppose, from that centipede. Maybe it's actually a millipede? Maybe, yeah. Yeah, and Elden saying the same thing. Okay. So let me back up, because I want to try to remember what he was saying. And then I'm probably going to do a little bit of an oddity and end the stream early, because I am like really losing it, to be honest. So, I mean, technically I'm not ending the stream early. I just meant like I'm ending it early in relation to having a video uncompleted. And we'll probably watch this, like the rest of it, first thing tomorrow.
That's described by the Mushroom Crown, which reads the following. Long ago, great lords served the scarlet rot. Perhaps such fungal bodies served as their crowns. Ultimately, I believe that the Hornsent worshipped the outer god of rot in the form of a bud, and that when the church was burned down in the Crusade, Romina managed to connect to this being and bring the scarlet rot into this realm.
Okay, so right. Now, the idea of the Hornsent worshipping the scarlet rot, I wonder if he means that incidentally or intentionally, because I could kind of see an incidental worshipping of scarlet rot happen, but I still would disagree with the notion that they did it before the Crusades happened, because of like the Church of Bud seemingly had no true affiliation with scarlet rot before that. But setting that aside, I think that also introduces issues with one's belief on whether they worship scarlet rot versus the divine lions of the skies or the divine birds, or even like the tutelary deities. But maybe there's enough room in this town for the both of them, or the four of them, or more of them. So that'll be something worth considering. So overall, I'm just kind of against this line of thought for right now. But okay. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and end things here because my faculties have been slipping pretty hard. But yeah, that'll be it for tonight's stream. We will continue the same time of 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So if you guys want me to get through the rest, or if you guys want to see me get through the rest of the video, it'll have to be tomorrow or in the next episode if you guys are catching the VODs. So as always, thank you so much for joining. Hope you take care and stay safe. Last Protagonist out.